He was a star in the NBA.
He was one of the top basketball players.
And she was the girl of his dreams.
She was the spotlight of wherever she went. Her smile, her personality, her looks.
For this dynamic pair, the world was their oyster.
She loved Eddie and Eddie loved her.
Until a shocking tragedy tore their bond asunder.
You see nothing but poof blood.
Unleashing an investigation that would expose a salacious tale of professional misconduct and unspeakable violence.
Opening that door was like a nuclear bomb dropping.
This case involves brutal murder, NBA superstars, multiple love triangles, and gang retributions. Everywhere you turn, there's a new mystery.
January 24th, 2009. It's a blustery Saturday evening in the trendy Chicago neighborhood of South Loop. But the weather's the last thing on Yolande Henry's mind as she and her boyfriend, Reginald Corner, drive to the upscale townhouse her 24-year-old daughter, Nova, calls home. Earlier that day, Nova was mysteriously absent from her beloved grandmother's funeral, and repeated calls to her cell phone have gone unanswered.
We're almost at the house, and I'll call you back later to let you know what's going on, okay?
At this point, I've got like everybody trying to call her, and we're not getting any answers.
Filled with a growing sense of dread, Yolande and Reginald make their way to the front door.
As we was going up the stairs, that eerie feeling just was there.
What Reginald and Yolande discover next is every parent's worst nightmare.
I opened the door to find Nova laying on the floor in a pool of her own blood.
Wait, okay, don't touch anything. Don't touch.
It appears Nova has been shot multiple times in the back, chest, and head. But that's not the worst part. Lying beside her bullet-riddled body is her 10-month infant, Ava.
I just remember being frozen. After that part, things became a blur. I could hear myself screaming and just lying on the floor.
Nova and Ava had been both shot in the head.
Both the young mother and daughter are dead, but the nightmare is just beginning. Nova also has a 3-year-old son.
I didn't know whether he was left in the house.
But fear for Nathan's safety is quickly eased.
Here he is.
What they found, in addition to Nova and Ava's body, was her son, who was alive but sleeping.
Her son was found in the chair with a blanket in the same room with Nova and Ava.
Yolande's grandson is covered in his mother's blood, but otherwise appears unharmed. Yolande and Reginald call 911.
Talk emergency care.
Yeah, can I get the police?
You need an ambulance?
Yeah, bring the ambulance, the police down.
Moments later, investigators and EMTs arrive on the scene. But not even the most jaded among them can fathom what unspeakable evil had touched this family, or the house of horrors they were about to expose.
I can't even describe it. It was just something like I was in a movie or something, I guess. I mean, it's like unreal.
Born in 1984, the oldest of 3 siblings, Nova Henry grew up in a loving home in southeast Chicago.
Nova was the big sister kind of mama to them, and they always looked up to her. She was small in stature, but big in personality.
A bright and bubbly teenager, Nova loved hanging out with friends, listening to music, and most of all, dancing.
I think what made us such good friends was our love for dancing. Our personalities just seemed to click.
Nova became a star on her high school pom-pom squad.
We went to the Apollo in New York twice. We all loved dancing to kind of stay out of trouble.
Naturally, the vivacious teenager had plenty of suitors, but one guy stood head and shoulders above the rest. 7 foot tall, Eddie Curry.
They had been friends first and foremost since junior high school. He respected her friendship and she respected his.
She thought that he had a great personality. He always made her laugh.
A gifted athlete, Eddie became a dominant force on their high school basketball team. Named a McDonald's High School All-American player, Eddie also earned the coveted title of Mr. Basketball in the state of Illinois.
Eddie was one of the top basketball players in high school.
With Eddie towering over the competition on the hardwood and Nova on the courtside cheering him on, these two friends grew close. And over their senior year, their friendship blossomed into a full-fledged romance.
I could tell that Nova was falling for Eddie. This was someone that she found a liking to, and I hope that it would go down the path of happiness.
To see them together was kind of awkward because she was so small and he was big, but he made her happy. So, I was happy for her.
After graduation, the young couple's fortunes soared when Eddie decided to skip college and go pro. He was selected 4th overall in the 2001 NBA draft.
He was a young man who had come into kind of like a jackpot.
But after signing a lucrative multi-million-dollar contract with his hometown Bulls, Eddie was quickly sucked into the never-ending travel and day-to-day grind of professional basketball.
As an NBA superstar, it can be incredibly challenging to maintain a faithful relationship at home. You have women throwing themselves at you in every city.
Not that Eddie let the time away from home or the temptations of the road stand in the way of his love for Nova.
Nova flew in and out of town frequently to visit him. She loved him a lot. Eddie loved her as well.
Of course, the beautiful and independent Nova had ambitions of her own. Enrolling in Illinois State University in 2003, Nova knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life.
She's always wanted to have a future career in dentistry and have her own office.
With both their careers taking off, these high school sweethearts seemed destined for greatness. Until one day, Nova was blindsided by some unexpected news.
Eddie Curry married? What?
Eddie was actually seeing a young lady by the name of Corey, and unbeknownst to Nova, he actually married her.
Nova found out by reading the newspaper.
Who is Corey?
So it was very hurtful when Nova found out about that.
But just 6 months into the marriage, Eddie filed for divorce from his new wife. In Nova's eyes, this proved that Eddie was still in love with her.
She got over it fairly quick because the paper is saying that he's asking for a divorce. So she looked at it as though he's trying to right his wrong and correct it.
Nova's hunch was right on target. Once the divorce was final, Eddie put the full court press on Nova.
He had sent a driver to come get her. She went out of town with him. Nova started going out to dinner with the Bulls players.
Nova and Eddie's love connection seemed stronger than ever. So strong that when Eddie was traded to the New York Knicks in 2005, Nova put her dental school dreams on hold and began splitting time between Chicago and New York.
She was in college, she was being flown to basketball games. That's a pretty exciting lifestyle to live at such a young age.
Later that year, Nova gave birth to a beautiful baby boy named Nathan.
When he was born, I saw a great change in Nova. From that day forward, she was just a mother.
2 years later, in 2008, Nova and Eddie had another child, daughter Ava.
She was just like the most beautiful chocolate baby. That's what I call it, my little chocolate mommy.
With 2 beautiful children and an NBA star boyfriend, life had never looked better for Nova Henry. But Nova's happiness came to a horrifying end on January 24th, 2009.
Just could never imagine that somebody would hurt my child or my grandchild.
I can't express in words, actually. I've seen a lot of things, nothing like that.
But as cops swarmed the scene, they're about to learn a shocking revelation. One that will not only expose a life of lies, but cast a seemingly fairy tale romance in a far more sinister light.
When I found out, I just couldn't believe the person that did this. I was just like, no. This can't be what's going on.
Nova Henry and NBA star Eddie Curry were beloved high school sweethearts. Together, they had 2 beautiful children and the world at their feet.
They were happy and he respected Nova. He showed that he cared for her.
He was kind of a breath of fresh air. Nova was in love with him.
But their dream life together is severed on January 24th of 2009. After Nova unexpectedly missed her grandmother's funeral, her mother Yolan checks on her and makes a terrifying discovery.
I remember her lying on her back and just blood everywhere. And at that point, I think I just went into hysterics.
Nova's death is only part of the tragedy. Her 10-month-old daughter, Ava, has also been murdered.
She was lying at the foot of her mom, and they had been shot multiple times.
Thankfully, Nova's 3-year-old son, Nathan, was unharmed in the attack.
There were blood smears on the walls. He had to have been, for lack of a better word, plain in the pool of blood left there by his mother and baby sister.
As the coroner's team removes the bodies to prep them for autopsy, detectives begin processing the scene. Even for the most seasoned officers, this double homicide is beyond the pale.
When you have a young mother and a 10-month-old baby who are both shot in the head, certainly victims as young as Ava was, it's terrible.
There was blood everywhere. It was a crime scene like no other. And to imagine who could have done this to this beautiful young woman and her child, it could have only been a monster.
Based on the position of the bodies and the numerous shell casings scattered throughout the home, detectives surmise the attack on Nova and her daughter originated from the back of the residence.
There was a trail of blood that led from the back room of Nova's home to the front door.
She ran for her life with her small infant in her arms. Those bullets went through Ava's head.
But what could have sparked this deadly rampage? Given that the attack originated from inside the house and that there are no signs of forced entry, detectives can rule out one possible motive.
No signs of a robbery or a burglary of any kind.
Is the gunman someone Nova knew and trusted? To Nova's friends and family, it's hard to believe anyone would want to intentionally harm her and Ava.
Nova was very outgoing, very compassionate, and she had a million friends.
If you knew Nova, you loved her. There was in a way not to like her unless you just were, hell-bent on not liking her, and that would have been your own fault.
Questioning Nova's friends and family, investigators discover Nova's relationship with Eddie was more complicated than they realized.
Nova and Eddie, I believe their ups and downs started shortly after she was going to leave college.
Nova knew I didn't necessarily agree with her decision to keep seeing and dating Eddie. He had been so dishonest throughout the relationship.
According to Nova's friends, she had only recently gotten over the shock of Eddie's surprise first marriage. But no sooner had she forgiven Eddie than Nova got wind of another equally as shocking engagement.
She found out that he was getting married.
This time to a woman named Francine.
She was working for the Bulls organization or working at their practice center.
We did find out via the news that he had actually gone and gotten married. He hadn't told Nova anything about it. And she basically was devastated.
For Nova, the insult was amplified by the fact that at the time, she herself was 5 months pregnant with her and Eddie's son, Nathan.
Nova was again blindsided and completely caught off guard. She was hurt.
She was very upset. I mean, I just imagine you're pregnant and you hear your child's father is getting married. You wouldn't even think he was in a relationship.
According to friends, shortly after Nathan was born, Eddie's financial support for Nova and baby Nathan began to wane.
The financial support was not coming in anymore.
At that point, Nova hired a local attorney named Frederick Goings to negotiate a formal child support arrangement.
So the feedback that I got from different people was, he's a good attorney, he's a hungry attorney, so I figured we could use him.
Hiring Frederick Goings paid off. A Chicago court granted Nova $6,000 a month in child support. But surprisingly, once the case settled, Nova and Eddie rekindled their romance.
She showed me a tattoo that she had got with Eddie's name on it. And that's when I knew they were back fooling around.
She was dealing with a married man. She knew it was wrong, but, she loved him.
But shortly after baby Ava was born, Eddie did another about-face and began to dispute Nova's claim that he was Ava's father. Nova and her attorney, Frederick Goings, had no choice but to haul Eddie back to court.
She wasn't setting out to purposely ruin Eddie's life or his wife's life.
There was a DNA test done to determine the paternity of Ava, and it was revealed that Eddie Curry was the biological father.
Based on his lucrative NBA contract and the fact that he was proven to be the father of both of Nova's children, Eddie was ordered to pay her $15,000 a month in child support. To investigators, this hefty payment raised the question, could Eddie be a person of interest in Nova's murder?
$15,000 is a substantial sum even for an NBA superstar. And to have to pay that every month certainly gives Eddie a reason to be upset.
For friends, family, and especially investigators, there's just one thing to do. Find Eddie Curry, and find him fast.
To me, the hunt was on.
Henry and NBA star Eddie Curry engaged in a passionate, nearly decade-long romance that produced 2 beautiful children. But when Eddie marries not once, but twice behind Nova's back, she seeks and is awarded $15,000 a month in child support.
She thought that he would willingly pay for his expenses because he knew that this was his baby. She was more so focused about him supporting the kids versus what Eddie and his wife are doing with themselves.
But just 4 months after winning her battle for child support, Nova and her infant daughter Ava are found gunned down inside Nova's upscale Chicago townhouse.
A whole nother life of hell is what it felt like to me.
After learning of the child support situation, detectives are curious if there's a connection between Eddie and this tragedy. Just hours into the investigation, they interview the NBA star.
Mr. Curry. Yes, sir. Sir, Texas Child Police Department.
Despite investigators' suspicions, Eddie seems genuinely distraught by the death of his daughter and former girlfriend.
Yeah, come on.
But that doesn't stop investigators from peppering Eddie with questions about his possible involvement in the crime.
You may have been behind or wasn't paying your child support. Do you know anything about that, or can you tell us anything?
I have no idea, man.
While Eddie admits their relationship had its ups and downs, the fact of the matter is he never stopped caring for Nova.
She loved Eddie and Eddie loved her.
Still, detectives want to know Eddie's exact whereabouts at the time of the shooting.
Where were you on the night of January 24th?
Turns out, Eddie has a rock-solid alibi, one that can be verified by 18,000 New York Knicks fans.
He was playing at Madison Square Garden the night of the murder. He was traveling to Philadelphia that next day to play a game against the 76ers. There was no evidence whatsoever to connect him to this double murder.
There was no doubt that Eddie cared for Nova. It's clear that Eddie would never hurt neither Nova or his children.
But there is someone close to Eddie who might harbor ill will towards Nova. Eddie's wife, Francine. Those close to the couple say Francine knew all about Nova and Eddie's relationship and was none too pleased about it.
She sent me an email and saying that she had heard that, Nova had his child and that she wanted to speak to her. She was upset.
Could Eddie's on-again, off-again relationship with Nova have troubled Francine? And if so, could she have hired someone to off her romantic rival?
Here we have a woman that has been in and out of Eddie's life for years. That absolutely gives her a motive.
But to investigators, it appears Francine is as distraught over the news of Nova's death as Eddie. And in their eyes, she seems to harbor little bitterness over Eddie and Nova's alleged romance.
She probably thought that he was being unfaithful just because of his fame and his money. And, that's what guys in that field are known for.
As for any direct confrontations with Nova, it seems she never met Eddie's ex face-to-face and only spoke to her on the phone.
They had the one phone conversation and that was pretty much it.
There was nothing that gave any evidence whatsoever that she was connected to this crime.
For investigators, it seems like another dead end. But a day into the investigation, they uncover another possible, albeit indirect, link between Eddie Curry and the crime.
In 2007, There were a series of crimes committed in Chicago at the hands of the traveling vice lords.
Notorious for their brutality and ruthlessness, the traveling vice lords have terrorized the streets of the Windy City since the 1970s, and they aren't afraid to target professional athletes in the Chicagoland area.
They targeted first Antoine Walker in 2007. They tied him up with duct tape and managed to steal more than $200,000 worth of jewelry and money and cars from his home.
2 weeks after the attack on Antoine Walker, members of the traveling vice lords set their sights on Eddie Curry.
Eddie Curry was also allegedly burglarized by the traveling vice lords. Both he and his wife were duct taped and was robbed at gunpoint in his home in Chicago.
2 members of the traveling vice lords were eventually arrested for the attack on Eddie Curry. Given the gang's propensity for violence, investigators wonder if Nova's death could somehow be connected.
It's very possible that members of the traveling vice lords could have sent a message to Eddie and to his family not to testify against him.
It's a chilling theory, one that now has everyone in Eddie and Nova's extended families living in fear.
I was just scared for the fact that somebody was going to try to come back and get my grandchild.
Nova Henry always believed she and high school sweetheart turned NBA star Eddie Curry were soulmates. And after having 2 beautiful children together, Nova wanted nothing more than to settle down with Eddie and raise their family.
I knew that they loved each other and they would always somehow find their ways back to each other.
There was just one problem. Eddie was married. And after Chicago police find Nova and her infant daughter, Ava, brutally murdered on January 24th, 2009, they turn to Eddie for answers. But it quickly becomes clear that Eddie and his wife, Francine, are 100% innocent of any wrongdoing.
There was no evidence whatsoever to connect him to this double murder.
But investigators have learned that a year and a half prior to Nova's death, a vicious Chicago street gang, the traveling vice lords, targeted Eddie and his wife in an armed robbery.
Eddie Curry was a victim in that home invasion. That case was looked at.
2 men were arrested in connection with the burglary that occurred at Eddie's home. This could have been a hit specifically designed by the traveling vice lords to keep Eddie from testifying in trial against them.
Detectives know the traveling vice lords have the muscle and the reputation for carrying out such a threat. But when investigators put out feelers through their gang unit, the word on the street is these 2 cases aren't connected.
There was absolutely no evidence linking that case and those offenders in that case to this double murder. None whatsoever.
If the traveling vice lords aren't behind this terrible crime, then who is? Looking for answers, detectives circle back to the crime scene and discover a startling new piece of evidence.
Neighbors heard gunshots from Nova's townhouse approximately 1:20, 1:25 p.m. Interestingly, before the gunshots were heard by these neighbors, they heard arguing between an adult man and an adult female.
Nova's neighbors can't ID the man's voice, but they say this wasn't the first time they heard arguing inside the home. Questioning friends and family again, detectives learn another new piece of information.
Yes, I was calling with some follow-up questions regarding Nova Henry.
Even though Nova still carried a torch for her high school sweetheart, Eddie, once the child support issue was resolved, she'd resolved to start seeing other people.
He was not going to be faithful, and she started to date other people.
Looking into Nova's past boyfriends, investigators have come across another familiar name, attorney Frederick Goings, who represented Nova in her child support case.
Frederick, to me, was like the equivalent of an ambulance chaser, except for he would chase women who would be involved in high-profile child support cases.
While there's no denying Frederick Goings got results in the courtroom, some of Nova's friends say he had begun lobbying to be more than just Nova's attorney.
He just tried to bombard her right off the bat with gifts and such.
Detectives' interests are piqued. If Nova and Frederick Goings were dating, It's an ethical violation of the oath Mr. Goings took as a member of the Illinois Bar.
You don't date your client. That's just one thing you don't do.
Detectives decide to broaden the scope of their investigation, and in doing so determine that Frederick and Nova often slept over at each other's houses, and that the more time they spent together, the more Frederick tried to keep Nova and her family apart.
What would you do without me? What would you do without me?
I don't need you, Frederick.
We learned from family and friends that the relationship was horribly volatile. He had attempted to isolate her from her family and friends right from the get-go.
Your kid's father don't want you. Who else is going to want you?
Look, don't start. I'm not in the mood, okay?
He would talk about her, the way she looked, or make her think that nobody else wanted her but him.
One night, with Nova's friend Pamela Owens looking on, the abuse turned physical.
Where do you think you're going?
Out? Where you going?
Frederick came to Nova's residence. He came in and, they got into an argument over me being there.
What? Excuse me?
Get up the steps, I said.
And he pushed her down the stairs.
When he put his hands on Nova, you were able to see it. That time it was visual bruises.
Searching court records, detectives discover Nova moved to file an order of protection against Frederick Goings, but never followed through on the paperwork.
There was an order of protection that was filed by Nova against Goings that she eventually let lapse a couple of weeks later.
If a claim isn't formalized, it makes it very difficult for police to follow through and be able to find them.
This, unfortunately, is very common in the cycle of domestic violence. He pursued her. He apologized repeatedly and profoundly, and she forgave him.
But even though she never went through with the order of protection, Nova made it clear to Frederick the relationship was over.
She knew that this was going to be her jump start to finally being happy and free from Frederick and to give her kids a new start.
She felt like she was getting her groove back, her life back.
Given the gruesome nature of Nova's murder and the hidden history of violence between her and Frederick, investigators are beginning to believe this hothead attorney might be the one who pulled the trigger. Chicago detectives have eliminated a host of suspects in the grisly shooting death of Nova Henry and her daughter, Ava. Among those ruled out is her former lover, NBA star Eddie Curry. Investigators now have a new suspect in their sights, Nova's former attorney, Frederick Goings.
It clearly was a volatile, tumultuous relationship, several threats, physical abuse throughout the period of time that they were together.
In an effort to locate Frederick, police obtain a warrant allowing them to trace his cell phone. And within 48 hours of the murder, they determine that Frederick is in a motel in Michigan City, Indiana, some 57 miles away from Chicago.
They saw the defendant's vehicle parked in a parking lot of a Comfort Inn in Michigan City, Indiana, and maintained their surveillance of that.
Detectives decide it's time to confront Frederick Goings.
Chicago Police Department.
Yeah, I know who you are.
We just wanted to ask you a few questions about your girlfriend, Nova Henry.
Frederick Goings doesn't ask a single thing about Nova or what any of this is about. I believe he asked, am I under arrest? And he was told no.
Mr. Goings refused to answer any questions, and the conversation was terminated, and that was it.
Despite their suspicions, detectives and Nova's family must be patient.
I didn't leave my house for at least a month.
I was worrying about him coming around. Just imagine every second just being terrified, like the boogeyman is gonna come and get you.
With no physical evidence linking Frederick to the crime, investigators aren't ready to arrest him. Instead, they execute a search warrant for his vehicle.
Investigators were looking for more concrete information. They were looking for anything that they could find that would connect him to the crime. They needed something to go on.
It doesn't take long for the search of Frederick's car to hit pay dirt.
Live round was found on the passenger seat of the defendant's vehicle. They found that live round matched the rounds at the crime scene.
Shortly after that, the coroner's office releases the results of Nova Henry's autopsy, which offers further evidence placing Frederick Goings at the crime scene.
Forensic examination revealed Goings had left his DNA inside of her and obviously had sex with her.
Investigators are taken aback.
The DNA inside Nova clearly was consistent with him coming by late that night and staying the night.
But why would Nova let a man like Frederick back into her life after all that he'd recently put her through?
I think for someone who is in a victim role in an abusive relationship, they just want to go back to that time when they trusted each other and, you know, they saw the good things in each other.
Whatever Nova's reasons for letting Frederick back into her life, the DNA evidence clearly places Frederick Goings at Nova Henry's residence shortly before she was murdered. As does surveillance footage investigators subpoena from the townhouse complex.
The day of the murder, they saw Frederick Goings' Range Rover pulling into her parking lot, and that vehicle remained there until 1:29 p.m. that afternoon.
That's not all. A search of Nova's home computer also places Frederick Goings inside her residence just prior to the murders.
Based on the forensic examination of the victim's computer, Frederick Goings clearly was sitting at her computer accessing his email accounts and bank accounts.
Between the shell casings, the DNA, the surveillance video, and the email records, investigators have more than enough evidence to throw the book at Frederick Goings.
On February 20th, 2009, an arrest warrant was issued for Frederick Goings for the murder of Nova Henry and her daughter, Ava.
I had no doubt in my mind that Frederick was the person that did this to Nova and Ava.
But during his initial pretrial hearing, Frederick Goings remains adamant he had nothing to do with either murder.
He turns around to us and says, I loved Nova and Ava. I didn't do this to Nova and Ava.
After 4 long years, the trial finally gets underway. During their opening arguments, prosecutors assert that on January 24th, 2009, Frederick Goings drove to Nova Henry's townhouse and begged her to let him in.
What do you want, Frederick? I can't talk to you. Come on. Can I come in?
I don't know.
Once inside, Frederick sweet-talked Nova into sleeping with him one last time. After they made love, Frederick began accosting Nova, though not about their relationship.
Nova.
What, Frederick?
What is this?
It wasn't in any jealous rage. It was fueled by greed.
$24,000 to be exact. Unbeknownst to Frederick, Nova had filed a petition contesting his attorney's fees in her earlier child support case.
Frederick Goings was sitting at her computer. He was looking at things, and at one point he opened the email that had a legal filing that Nova Henry's new attorney was going to contest his attorney fees.
That's when he literally went ballistic
No, get off of me!
and used his handgun to shoot 24-year-old Nova Henry and her 10-month-old baby girl.
No!
To bolster their version of events, prosecutors point to the autopsy report, the surveillance footage, the evidence seized from Nova's computer, and the shell casings recovered inside Frederick's SUV.
The Chicago PD did a great job of building a case towards him.
When it was their turn, Frederick's attorneys point out the lack of a murder weapon, as well as the fact that not a single eyewitness could place him at the scene.
The defense tried to do was to isolate each piece of evidence and place it in an individual vacuum instead of looking at it all together, which, say, look over here, look at there, poke holes, reasonable doubt. That's what they're supposed to do. And they certainly tried to come up with alternate theories.
Nova's family worries the tactic could plant the seed of reasonable doubt in jurors' minds.
We were just so nervous, and anxiety was going through everyone.
You never know for sure what a jury's going to do in any type of case.
But there's one last witness who's yet to take the stand. A witness whose testimony will leave little doubt about what really happened the day of the crime.
I asked them, I said, who hurt Mommy and Ava?
February 4th, 2013, Chicago, Illinois. Attorney Frederick Goings is on trial for the shooting deaths of his former client turned lover, Nova Henry, and her infant daughter, Ava, the child of a previous relationship with NBA basketball star Eddie Curry. Prosecutors have argued that Frederick had Nova trapped in a vicious cycle of verbal and physical abuse. And when he realized Nova intended to contest the legal fee she owed him, he snapped.
When Frederick Goings discovered that objection to his petition for legal fees, he committed both the murder of Nova and Ava.
Frederick goes into his email and he discovers that Nova has a plan to take away some substantial money from him. And he goes into a blind, just rage, and shoots Nova and her daughter.
Frederick's defense attorneys have countered by pointing out the absence of a murder weapon or eyewitnesses.
Defense attorneys like to point holes and say, well, you don't have a live witness.
But as prosecutors are quick to point out, there is one survivor who witnessed the attack. Nova's 3-year-old son, Nathan Curry.
Nova's son actually witnessed this heinous crime. It's a delicate balance in getting to the truth of what happened and what's in the best interest of the child.
In a bold move, prosecutors lobby to the judge to make an exception to the hearsay rule and allow Nova's mother, Yolande, to testify about a conversation she had with her frightened grandson shortly after she discovered the bodies of her daughter and granddaughter.
Courts are very strict about hearsay evidence. In this case, however, the court made a decision that he was really just too young and decided that Nova's mother was the best person to relate that story.
With the judge setting aside the hearsay rule, Nova's mother, Yolande, testifies about the chilling conversation she had with her grandson after she discovered the bodies.
I was sitting with him. My first thing was I unwrapped him from the cover, just to check him to make sure that he wasn't wounded. He just started talking. And so I went along with it and I asked him, I said, who hurt Mommy and Ava?
Can you tell Grandma who did that to Mommy and Ava? Can you tell me?
Frederick.
Her son being left in this home with his mother and baby sister dead on the floor in his living room and having to be with them for over 4.5 hours. I hope to God he never remembers any of that particular day as he grows up.
Yolande's heartbreaking testimony erases any lingering doubts. And on February 12, 2013, the jury convicts Frederick Goings of 2 counts of first-degree murder. 51 days later, the judge sentences him to life in prison.
When they said life, I was satisfied because I knew that that would be like death to him, because his freedom and his arrogance of being able to do whatever he wanted is something that he cherished.
I just remember a huge weight being lifted. It was finally kind of some closure and a relief.
This was about money and the fact that he was so fueled by his greed that what ultimately drove him over the edge to shoot this woman. To me, that takes him into an entirely different category.
But even with Frederick Goings behind bars, there's nothing that can bring back Nova Henry or the precious young daughter she had with her high school sweetheart turned basketball superstar.
Eddie and Nova's relationship was flawed. And even though there were those tumultuous times in their relationship, Eddie loved Nova and his sweet 2 young children. This murder just ruined a beautiful young family, destroyed a mother and her young child, leaving another child without a mother.
I told Frederick, my life is forever scarred. I can't move forward. I'm stuck in this hatred. I'm stuck in sadness. I'm stuck in...
The rain in Western Oregon does not just fall. It buries. It washes over the coastal pines, seals the loam, and swallows secrets whole until the earth itself feels complicit. In the late autumn of 1986, in a quiet logging town outside Eugene, the rain did not stop for 3 weeks, and during those 3 weeks, a young woman vanished into the gray fog without leaving a single footprint, a single torn piece of clothing, or a solitary scream. The community woke up to an empty bed, a cold cup of coffee still sitting on a Formica kitchen counter, and a front door unlocked, swinging gently in the damp Pacific Northwest breeze. For 40 years, that empty house stood as a monument to a phantom, a haunting reminder that someone among them had walked out of the shadows, taken a life, and stepped backward into the mist completely undetected. The local police department filed the folders away under the heavy label of a cold case, a permanent stain on the county's ledger, while an innocent man sat in the suffocating silence of public suspicion, his life entirely dismantled by the quiet whispers of a town that had already judged him guilty. They looked at his face, they looked at his hands, and they saw a monster, never realizing that the true shadow walking among them wore the exact same face, shared the exact same blood, and carried the exact same genetic code. The nightmare began on a Tuesday morning when the shifts at the lumber mill were changing, and the air smelled of wet cedar and diesel exhaust. Karen Vance was 22 years old, a vibrant library assistant who spent her weekends hiking the rugged trails of the Cascade foothills and volunteering at the local animal shelter. She was a fixture of the community, the kind of person who noticed when an elderly neighbor hadn't picked up their mail or when a stray dog was shivering under the awning of the grocery store. When she failed to show up for her shift at the university archive, her coworkers didn't immediately panic. They assumed the torrential downpours had flooded the lower mountain roads or caused a mudslide near her isolated cabin. But by late afternoon, when her vintage blue sedan remained parked in the gravel driveway of her home, its windshield covered in fallen maple leaves, the silence turned deafening. Her mother arrived at the house to find the lights burning bright against the daytime gloom, the radio softly playing a soft rock station, and her daughter's purse, keys, and winter coat still resting on the bench by the entryway. It was as if Karen had simply evaporated mid-motion, pulled through the walls by an invisible hand, leaving behind a domestic tableau that felt frozen in time. First responders flooded the saturated property, their heavy boots churning the gravel road into a thick soup of mud, effectively destroying any fragile trace evidence that might have pointed to a struggle. There were no signs of forced entry, no broken glass, no blood spatters on the pale wallpaper, and no indication that Karen had fought for her life. The search parties expanded into the surrounding wilderness, hundreds of volunteers wearing bright yellow rain slickers moving shoulder to shoulder through the dense underbrush, their flashlights cutting weak beams through the suffocating fog. They combed the ravines, dragged the swollen creeks, and peered into abandoned logging shafts, but the forest gave up nothing. As the days bled into weeks, the initial desperation hardened into a grim reality. Karen Vance was gone, and the pristine lack of evidence suggested a predator who knew exactly how to navigate both the rugged terrain and the blind spots of small-town law enforcement. The investigation quickly stalled, caught in a loop of dead-end tips and false sightings, until the spotlight of suspicion shifted violently toward the one man who had been closest to her. David Miller was Karen's fiancé, a quiet, introverted diesel mechanic who spent his evenings working on heavy machinery and keeping mostly to himself. To the outer world, he was the devoted partner who had spent months helping Karen renovate her cabin, but to the eyes of small-town gossip, his quiet demeanor was quickly reinterpreted as callous indifference. The detectives, desperate for a breakthrough under the crushing pressure of a terrified public, locked onto David as their prime suspect. They interrogated him for hours in a windowless room, pressing him on his whereabouts, his alibi, and the minor, ordinary disagreements that every young couple experiences. David maintained his innocence with a desperate, breaking voice, explaining that he had been 20 miles away working the night shift at the commercial garage, a claim verified by his time cards, but dismissed by investigators who believed he could have slipped away during his break. The town turned on him with a vicious speed. Windows at his mechanic shop were smashed, cruel graffiti appeared on his driveway, and former friends crossed the street to avoid walking past him. Though the district attorney lacked the physical evidence to file formal charges, no body, no crime scene, no weapon, David was tried, convicted, and sentenced in the court of public opinion, condemned to live as a pariah in the very valley where he was raised. For decades, David Miller lived under the suffocating weight of an uncharged murderer, his name forever linked to the cold case that refused to die. Every anniversary of Karen's disappearance brought a fresh wave of media scrutiny, local television stations broadcasting his old mugshot from the initial questioning, keeping the embers of suspicion burning bright. He watched his life erode into isolation, never marrying, never leaving the county, because fleeing would look like an admission of guilt, stuck in a purgatory constructed entirely of rumor and circumstantial doubt. Meanwhile, the Real killer moved freely through the same streets, attending the same summer festivals, shopping at the same grocery stores, and listening to the same hushed conversations about the tragedy. The true perpetrator was David's identical twin brother, Darren Miller, a man who possessed the exact same physical features, the exact same walk, and, crucially, the exact same DNA profile that modern forensics would eventually seek out. Darren had watched his brother's slow social execution with a calculated, terrifying silence, using his twin as the ultimate human shield, knowing that any trace of physical evidence found at a crime scene would automatically point directly to David. The breakthrough did not come from a sudden confession or a deathbed revelation, but from the relentless, silent march of genetic technology. In the mid-2020s, a new generation of cold case investigators reopened the Vance file, determined to apply cutting-edge investigative genetic genealogy to the microscopic traces of biological material that had been preserved in a sealed envelope in the evidence locker. Back in 1986, technicians had managed to scrape a minute sample of foreign skin cells from a window latch that had been overlooked during the initial chaotic search of Karen's cabin. Using advanced DNA sequencing, forensic genealogists built a comprehensive genetic profile and uploaded it into public ancestry databases, expecting to find a distant cousin or a family branch that would point them toward a new suspect. Instead, the computer system flagged an absolute, unmistakable match that sent shockwaves through the department. The DNA belonged to the Miller family line, specifically matching the profile of the man who had been suspected for 40 years. But when the forensic experts looked closer at the specific genetic markers and cross-referenced them with modern, deep sequencing techniques capable of detecting rare, post-zygotic mutations, a chilling discrepancy emerged. The science of forensics had evolved past the point of simple matching. It could now differentiate between identical twins by analyzing somatic mutations, tiny, unique changes in the genetic code that occur after the embryo splits in the womb. The State Crime Lab, working in tandem with a specialized university research team, discovered that the microscopic sample left on the window latch in 1986 contained a specific genetic variance that David Miller did not possess, but his twin brother, Darren, did. The realization hit the investigative team like a physical blow. They had spent nearly half a century tracking the right face, but the wrong man. A covert surveillance operation was immediately launched against Darren Miller, who is now a 60-year-old grandfather living a seemingly mundane life just 3 towns over from the original crime scene. Detectives tracked him to a local diner, waiting patiently until he discarded a disposable coffee cup in a public trash can. The cup was rushed to the laboratory under emergency protocols, and within 48 hours, the results came back definitive. Darren Miller's DNA was an absolute match to the killer's profile. The morning of the arrest was cold and sharp, mirroring the day Karen Vance disappeared 40 years earlier. Police cruisers surrounded Darren Miller's suburban home, their red and blue lights reflecting off the wet pavement as tactical officers breached the front door. The arrest shocked the community to its core. Neighbors stood on their lawns in disbelief, watching a man they considered a pillar of the neighborhood being led away in handcuffs, his face pale and his expression vacant. In the interrogation room, faced with the irrefutable reality of modern genetic science that bypassed his brother's identity, Darren's decades of composure finally cracked. He began to speak, his voice a low, gravelly monotone as he detailed the events of that fateful 1986 night, how he had coveted his brother's life, how he had entered the cabin through the side window while Karen was alone, and how he had used the thick forest and the relentless autumn rain to hide his crime, confident that if anyone were ever blamed, it would be the twin who shared his face. The resolution of the cold case brought a bittersweet, overwhelming wave of emotion to the Pacific Northwest Valley, exposing a tragedy within a tragedy. For David Miller, the news of his brother's arrest was not a moment of triumph, but a profound, devastating vindication that arrived far too late to restore the youth, the reputation, and the peace that had been stolen from him. He had spent his adult life in the shadow of a crime he did not commit, betrayed by his own flesh and blood, who had used their shared identity as a weapon of absolute evasion. The community was forced to look inward, confronting the devastating cost of their collective rush to judgment and the decades of cruelty inflicted upon an innocent man. As Darren Miller was led into the county courthouse to face formal charges of first-degree murder, the long-delayed justice served as a haunting reminder of the secrets that can lie hidden behind the most familiar faces, and how the truth, no matter how deeply buried by time and rain, eventually finds its way into the light. The echo of the handcuffs clicking shut around Darren Miller's wrists did not just signal the end of a 40-year manhunt. It shattered the fragile glass illusion of peace that a whole generation of Oregonians had built around their lives. For decades, the narrative had been set in stone, whispered over backyard fences, and passed down to children as a cautionary tale about the quiet mechanic who got away with murder. The sudden, violent shift in the axis of truth left the community reeling in a state of collective vertigo. It was one thing to believe that a monster lived among them in the form of a solitary, brooding outsider like David. It was an entirely different, far more terrifying reality to realize that the monster was actually the gregarious, smiling family man who organized the neighborhood block parties, coached youth baseball, and sat in the front pew of the community church every Sunday morning. The realization that Darren Miller had used his own identical twin brother as a human shield, watching David's life burn to ashes while he built a sanctuary of respectability on the foundation of that betrayal, sent a wave of revulsion through the entire state. To understand how a deception of this magnitude survived the scrutiny of 4 decades, one has to return to the immediate aftermath of the 1986 investigation, a period when forensic science was still in its infancy and small-town police departments relied heavily on intuition, pressure, and circumstantial timelines. When Karen Vance vanished, the pressure on the local sheriff's department was immense. The Pacific Northwest was already haunted by the specters of serial predators who utilized the vast, dark corridors of Interstate 5 and the logging roads to discard their victims. The public demanded an immediate arrest, a scapegoat to restore their sense of security. The detectives on the case, overwhelmed by the lack of physical evidence, locked onto David Miller because his emotional response did not fit their expectations of grief. He was numb, paralyzed by shock, and unable to articulate his movements with the practiced precision of a guilty man who had prepared an alibi. They mistook his psychological trauma for cold-blooded guilt, and once that narrative was locked into the minds of the investigators, every piece of surrounding information was warped to fit the theory. Darren Miller, meanwhile, played the role of the supportive, grieving brother with a terrifyingly calculated precision. In the weeks following the disappearance, as search parties combed the dense timberlands, Darren was at the forefront, carrying maps, coordinating volunteer shifts, and consoling Karen's devastated parents. He stood shoulder to shoulder with the investigators, offering insights into his brother's personality, subtly dropping hints about David's supposed dark moods and unpredictable temper. It was a masterclass in psychological manipulation. By positioning himself as the helpful, cooperative extension of the family, Darren completely deflected any potential scrutiny from himself. If an investigator noticed a physical resemblance to a silhouette seen near Karen's cabin on the night of the crime, it was instantly attributed to David. If a witness recalled seeing a blue and gray flannel shirt matching the suspect's description in a local diner, it was assumed to be David's. Darren had effectively split his own identity, assigning all of his dark impulses, his midnight movements, and his homicidal malice to his brother, while retaining the pure, untainted half of their shared genetic identity for himself. The psychological toll on David Miller during these years was a slow, agonizing execution of the soul. He did not just lose the woman he loved, he lost his humanity in the eyes of everyone he had ever known. He watched his business dry up as local logging companies pulled their maintenance contracts from his shop, refusing to have their equipment serviced by a suspected killer. He watched his childhood friends turn their heads when he walked down the aisle of the hardware store, their silence louder than any shouted accusation. The walls of his world closed in until his entire existence was confined to the perimeter of his small property, surrounded by the same dark pines that held the secret of Karen's final moments. He began to question his own sanity, wondering if the weight of the town's hatred would eventually crush him completely. He did not know that just a few miles away, his identical twin was living the life that should have been theirs to share, raising children, celebrating milestones, and enjoying the unearned warmth of a community that had cast David into the outer darkness. The turning point that would ultimately unravel Darren's 40-year lie began not in a police station, but in the sterile, brightly lit laboratory of a forensic genomics firm in California. By the mid-2020s, the field of DNA analysis had undergone a revolution that early investigators could not have conceived in their wildest dreams. For years, identical twins were considered the ultimate wild card in forensic science because standard short tandem repeat, STR, DNA testing, the gold standard for criminal databases, could not differentiate between them. If an identical twin left blood, semen, or saliva at a crime scene, the results would return a statistical match to both individuals, leaving prosecutors with a legal stalemate if both denied the crime. But the advent of next-generation sequencing, NGS, and ultra-deep whole genome sequencing changed the rules of engagement entirely. Scientists discovered that as identical twins grow and develop, their cells accumulate completely random genetic errors known as somatic point mutations or single nucleotide polymorphisms, SNPs. These mutations occur after the fertilized egg splits and are entirely unique to each twin, serving as a microscopic, infallible digital signature that can separate one brother from another. When the cold case unit resurrected the Vance file, they were not looking for a twin. They were simply looking to see if the degraded biological sample recovered from the window latch could yield enough genetic material for a standard modern profile. The sample was incredibly small, a microscopic cluster of epithelial skin cells that had been preserved on a piece of adhesive lifting tape inside a paper evidence bag since 1986. The tape had dried out, the adhesive had turned to a brittle yellow crust, but the genetic material trapped beneath it remained frozen in time, protected from the damp Oregon air. Utilizing a process known as low-copy number DNA amplification, forensic scientists managed to replicate the ancient strands of DNA millions of times until they had a viable sequence. When they ran the profile through the national database, it flagged David Miller, just as it would have decades earlier. But the lead genetic genealogist on the case noticed something unusual when reviewing the ultra-deep sequencing data. There were 3 specific, anomalous base pair variations in the sequence that did not align with the reference sample David had provided to police during his initial elimination testing years ago. This discrepancy was the thread that pulled the entire tapestry of deception apart. The investigators realized that the DNA on the window latch did not belong to David Miller. It belonged to someone who shared 99.99% of his genetic structure, but possessed a distinctly different set of post-split somatic mutations. The realization was a lightning bolt through the department. The case file was dusted off, the family trees were re-examined, and the focus of the 40-year-old murder investigation shifted with terrifying velocity toward Darren Miller. The challenge for the modern detectives was no longer about finding the killer. It was about gathering a fresh, pristine sample of Darren's DNA without his knowledge, ensuring that he did not realize the net was closing in and attempt to flee or destroy evidence. The surveillance operation that followed was a masterpiece of patient, tactical law enforcement. For 3 weeks, undercover officers tracked Darren's daily routine, mapping his movements from his suburban home to the local hardware supply store where he worked as a consultant, to the diner where he met his retired friends for morning coffee. They watched him interact with the world, noting how his smile never reached his eyes, how he constantly scanned his surroundings with the hypervigilant awareness of a man who had been running a marathon for 40 years and knew the finish line was always just out of sight. They needed a discarded item, an abandoned piece of garbage that contained enough saliva or skin cells to run a comparative analysis against the window latch sequence. The opportunity finally presented itself on a rainy Thursday afternoon at a roadside gas station. Darren bought a styrofoam cup of black coffee, took several sips as he sat in his pickup truck, and then tossed the empty cup into a public waste bin before driving away. Within 30 seconds, An undercover detective retrieved the cup, sealed it in a sterile biohazard bag, and dispatched it via a high-speed courier directly to the state crime lab. The waiting period was an agony of tension for the cold case team. If the lab results came back negative, if the mutations didn't match, the investigation would be back at square one, and David Miller would remain trapped in his lifelong purgatory. But when the digital readout flashed on the technician's screen 48 hours later, the match was absolute, undeniable, and mathematically perfect. The 3 rare somatic mutations found on the 1986 window latch were present in the saliva left on that styrofoam coffee cup. Darren Miller was the man who had climbed through Karen Vance's window. He was the man who had extinguished her life in the dark of that autumn night, and he was the man who had let his own twin brother take the blame for half a lifetime. The execution of the arrest warrant was timed to prevent any chance of a violent standoff or a tragic resolution. They did not want Darren to have the opportunity to take his own life or destroy the final secret of where Karen's body was hidden. At 6 a.m., as the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the Oregon pines, 3 unmarked tactical vehicles pulled into Darren's driveway. The officers did not use sirens, but the heavy, rhythmic thud of their boots on the porch was enough to awaken the household. When Darren opened the door, dressed in his bathrobe, his eyes did not register confusion or outrage. They registered an overwhelming, ancient exhaustion. It was the look of a man who had been holding a heavy iron gate shut against a flooding river, and the hinges had finally snapped. He went down to his knees without a word, offering his wrists to the zip ties as his wife watched from the hallway, her screams echoing through the quiet neighborhood as the illusion of her 40-year marriage dissolved into the damp morning air. The subsequent interrogation of Darren Miller will go down in the annals of criminal psychology as one of the most chilling demonstrations of compartmentalized sociopathy ever recorded. Sitting in the interview room, stripped of his respectable civilian clothing and wearing a standard-issue orange jumpsuit, Darren did not deny the evidence. The confrontation with his own unique genetic signature seemed to unlock a dam of suppressed memories that he had kept buried deep within his subconscious. He spoke in a flat, conversational tone, as if he were discussing the maintenance schedule of a tractor rather than the brutal termination of a young woman's life. He detailed how he had watched Karen from the tree line for weeks, driven by an intense, burning jealousy of his brother's happiness. He believed that David did not deserve her, that David was too weak, too quiet, too insignificant to possess something so beautiful. On the night of the murder, he had waited until he knew David was locked into his shift at the commercial garage, ensuring the perfect alibi for his brother, and by extension, the perfect shield for himself. He described the confrontation inside the cabin with a clinical detachment that made the seasoned detectives in the room grow cold. He had entered through the window, catching Karen by surprise as she walked out of the kitchen. When she screamed his brother's name, thinking it was David playing a cruel joke, Darren realized that the physical resemblance was his ultimate weapon. He did not correct her. He let her believe, in those final, terrifying moments of her life, that the man attacking her was the man she had promised to marry. After the deed was done, he carried her body through the torrential rain to the back of his own truck, driving deep into the unmapped logging tracts of the Coast Range, where he buried her beneath the roots of an overturned old-growth cedar, a place where the shifting earth and 40 years of pine needles would ensure she was never found by a casual search party. The revelation of the burial site led to a somber, sacred operation in the remote hills of Lane County. A team of forensic anthropologists, accompanied by cadaver dogs and heavy excavation equipment, spent 4 days navigating the dense, muddy terrain that Darren had sketched out on a yellow legal pad in the interrogation room. The site was completely overgrown, the landscape altered by decades of logging and natural forest growth, but beneath 3 feet of rich, black soil, nestled within the ancient root system of the giant cedar, they found her. Karen Vance was finally recovered, her remains still bearing the faint remnants of the clothing she wore on the night she vanished, bringing a devastating, conclusive end to the mystery that had haunted her family for a generation. But while the recovery of Karen's body provided a long-sought closure for her surviving relatives, the damage inflicted upon David Miller could never be undone. When the detectives drove out to his isolated property to deliver the news, to tell him that he was officially cleared, that his brother was in custody, and that the world finally knew the truth, David did not celebrate. He sat on his porch, looking out at the rain, his face lined with the deep, permanent furrows of a lifetime spent under suspicion. The system had cleared his name, but it could not return the 40 years he had spent as a ghost in his own hometown. It could not return the family he never built, the career he never had, or the brother he thought he knew. The true horror of the Oregon 1986 cold case was not just that a life had been taken in the dark, but that the ripple effects of that single act of violence had claimed a second victim, condemning an innocent man to live out his days as a living monument to his brother's absolute depravity. The legal shockwave following Darren Miller's confession ripped through the Oregon judicial system like a high-voltage current, exposing the structural fragility of small-town justice and leaving a trail of institutional panic in its wake. Within hours of the news breaking, the county courthouse was besieged by satellite trucks, investigative journalists, and a stunned, furious public demanding to know how a system could leave an innocent man under a cloud of homicide suspicion for 4 decades while the true killer operated in plain sight. The district attorney's office, which had spent 40 years defending the legacy of the original investigators, suddenly found itself in a defensive crouch. The paperwork that had bound David Miller to a lifetime of informal surveillance and societal exile was hastily dismantled, but the legal system had no pre-written script for an apology of this magnitude. There was no standard protocol for telling a man that his entire adult existence had been sacrificed to protect the perfect alibi of his identical twin. As the state prepared its formal indictment against Darren Miller, a parallel investigation began into the original 1986 file, revealing a series of confirmation biases and missed opportunities that bordered on criminal negligence. The archives showed that back in the winter of 1986, 2 separate tips had been called into the sheriff's tip line regarding a dark-colored pickup truck seen speeding down the logging bypass road just hours after Karen Vance vanished. One caller had explicitly noted that the driver looked exactly like David Miller but was driving a vehicle with a different tailgate configuration, a detail that perfectly matched Darren's truck at the time. Yet, because the detectives were already convinced of David's guilt, those tips were filed away in a box labeled Unverified Sightings and never cross-referenced. The system had locked its eyes onto one target and deliberately blinded itself to any evidence that threatened to disrupt its chosen narrative. The atmospheric tension inside the Lane County Jail, where Darren was being held without bail, was palpable. Correctional officers reported that Darren remained unbothered by his sudden fall from grace, adapting to his concrete cell with the same chilling, methodical detachment he had used to navigate his civilian life. He did not ask for a lawyer during his initial processing, nor did he request to see his family. Instead, he spent his hours reading true crime paperbacks from the jail library and eating his meals with a steady, unhurried rhythm. To the psychologists who evaluated him, Darren exhibited the classic traits of an apex behavioral chameleon, a man who did not possess an internal moral compass, but had spent 50 years meticulously copying the emotional expressions of those around him to pass as human. His life had been an elaborate theatrical performance, and now that the curtain had been pulled back, he felt no shame, only a clinical appreciation for how long the play had lasted. Outside the jail walls, the fallout within the Miller family was catastrophic. Darren's adult children, who had grown up believing their father was a hardworking, gentle provider, found themselves overnight as the descendants of a monster. Their childhood memories were instantly recontextualized through a lens of profound horror. The family camping trips into the Cascade Mountains, the weekends spent hunting in the very territory where Karen's body lay buried, the quiet moments when their father would stare out into the woods with an unreadable expression, all of it was poisoned. His wife of 35 years filed for emergency divorce within a week of the arrest, unable to sit in the same room as the stranger she had shared a bed with for over 3 decades. The family name, which had once carried weight in the local logging community, became a brand of generational shame, forcing Darren's children to consider changing their names just to protect their own infants from the toxic radiation of their father's crimes. For David Miller, the official lifting of suspicion brought no sense of liberation, only a deeper, more profound awareness of the vacuum where his life should have been. The local media, eager to pivot from their decades of hostile coverage, attempted to frame him as a tragic hero, casting him as a resilient survivor of a historic miscarriage of justice. Reporters camped out at the edge of his gravel driveway, holding out microphones and offering lucrative contracts for exclusive television interviews. But David refused to play the role of the redemptive victim. He remained inside his house, the blinds drawn tight against the afternoon sun, his only companion the old hunting dog that slept by the wood stove. When a local community group attempted to organize a public fund to compensate him for his decades of suffering, he sent a short, handwritten note to the town council requesting they dismantle the effort immediately. He did not want their charity, he did not want their pity, and most of all, he did not want their late-stage forgiveness. Their sudden shift from hatred to sympathy only highlighted the shallow, fickle nature of the community that had condemned him without a trial. The forensic excavation at the old-growth cedar site continued for days, transforming the remote logging tract into a high-tech crime laboratory in the mud. Specialized search and rescue teams, working alongside state police criminologists, meticulously sifted through every cubic centimeter of dirt surrounding the root system. They were looking for more than just skeletal remains. They were searching for personal items, physical artifacts that could tie Darren to the burial site beyond his verbal confession. They recovered a rusted metal zipper, 3 plastic buttons from a winter coat, and crucially, a small, corroded silver locket that Karen had worn on the day she disappeared. Inside the locket, protected by a remarkably resilient rubber seal, was a tiny, faded photograph of David. The discovery was a cruel, poetic irony that left the field technicians weeping in the rain. Even in her dark, lonely grave beneath the pines, Karen had carried the image of the innocent man who would spend the rest of his life paying the price for her murder. The legal strategy for Darren's defense team was virtually non-existent given the absolute certainty of the deep genome sequencing data. His court-appointed attorney, a veteran defender used to fighting uphill battles, openly admitted to colleagues that there was no viable path to an acquittal. You could not argue chain of custody when the somatic mutations matched a discarded coffee cup with a mathematical probability of 1 in several billion. You could not argue coercion when the defendant had accurately drawn a map to a hidden grave that no living soul could have located by chance. The only remaining question was whether the state would pursue the death penalty, an option still technically on the books for aggravated murder committed prior to certain state moratoriums, or if they would accept a plea of true life without the possibility of parole in exchange for Darren's full cooperation in closing out other unresolved missing persons cases in the region. As news of the twin brother dynamic spread globally, cold case units across the Pacific Northwest began cross-referencing Darren Miller's employment records and travel history with unsolved abductions dating back to the late 1970s. Detectives from Washington, Idaho, and Northern California arrived in Lane County with thick binders of unsolved files, wondering if Karen Vance had been Darren's first victim or simply the one where he had grown careless. They looked at his early 20s, a period when he worked as a long-haul trucker moving timber and heavy machinery across state lines, leaving a trail of unmonitored nights along the dark highways of the West. The realization that an identical twin could commit multiple crimes while his innocent brother provided a permanent, built-in DNA alibi sent shivers through the entire law enforcement apparatus. Every cold case involving an identical twin suspect was suddenly thrown back into the light, with departments scrambling to find budget allocations for the expensive, ultra-deep sequencing needed to separate one brother's genetic signature from another. The psychological dimension of the case became the subject of intense study at the state psychiatric hospital, where forensic experts tried to understand how Darren had maintained his sanity while watching his twin brother endure decades of public destruction. In interviews conducted by state psychologists, Darren revealed that he did not view David as a separate human being with feelings and aspirations. He viewed him as an asset, a genetic duplicate that existed to absorb the negative consequences of his own actions. David was always the quiet one, Darren reportedly told an evaluator with a faint, chilling smile. He was built to carry heavy things. I just gave him something real to carry. This utter lack of empathy, combined with an intellectual capacity to mimic normal human affection, allowed Darren to compartmentalize the murder so completely that he never suffered from nightmares, never experienced a moment of panic when police cruisers drove past his house, and never felt a flicker of remorse when he saw his brother's broken figure walking down the local highway. The countdown to the formal arraignment brought an eerie, expectant silence to the valley. The local newspaper, which had spent 40 years running sensational headlines about the fiancé suspect, prepared a special multi-page retrospective that was meant to serve as a public confession of their own journalistic failures. The community was forced to confront its own reflection in the mirror, recognizing how their hunger for an easy answer had allowed them to become weaponized by a psychopath. They had wanted a villain so badly that they had manufactured one out of a grieving young man's silence, creating the perfect smokescreen for the real predator to breed a family, build a career, and live out his days in comfort. The impending trial was not just a judgment of Darren Miller. It was a reckoning for the entire town, a collective unmasking of the darkness that can thrive when a community chooses gossip over truth and vengeance over evidence. On the night before the arraignment, a small, spontaneous vigil was held outside the gates of Karen Vance's old cabin. The current owners had left the property dark, but local residents placed hundreds of small, flickering candles along the gravel driveway where her car had sat frozen in time 40 years ago. There were no speeches, no songs, and no prayers. The crowd stood in total silence, listening to the steady, relentless patter of the autumn rain against the pine canopy. They looked toward the dark woods, understanding now that the forest had never been the enemy. The trees had simply held the truth until the world was intelligent enough to decode it, protecting the final resting place of a stolen daughter until science could pierce the perfect deception of a brother's face. And a few miles away, in his darkened house, David Miller watched the reflection of those candles through his window, his face illuminated by the weak, distant glow of a justice that had taken half a century to arrive and had arrived with nothing left to save. The morning of the formal arraignment arrived under a canopy of bruised, low-hanging clouds that threatened another deluge. The Lane County Courthouse, a stark concrete structure built in the mid-century style, was surrounded by barriers to hold back a crowd that had begun gathering at dawn. For the first time in 40 years, the spectators were not there to glare at David Miller. They were there to catch a glimpse of the brother who had used the very fabric of his birth to execute a perfect lifetime of deception. When the transport van arrived from the jail, its tires crunching heavily over the wet asphalt, a profound, heavy silence fell over the onlookers. The back door swung open, and Darren Miller stepped out, flanked by two towering sheriff's deputies. He did not duck his head. He did not wear a hood or sunglasses to shield his eyes from the barrage of camera flashes. He looked directly into the lenses, his face composed, his expression so identical to the man the town had hated for 40 years that several older residents gasped, momentarily confused about which twin they were looking at. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of wet wool and nervous energy. Every seat in the gallery was filled, populated by retired loggers who had searched the woods in 1986, members of the Vance family who had spent decades praying for this day, and young true crime enthusiasts who viewed the case as a historic legal anomaly. David Miller was notably absent. His attorney had issued a brief statement the previous evening stating that his client would not be attending any court proceedings, preferring to let the evidence speak in his absence. The empty space on the right side of the gallery, where David would have sat, felt like a deliberate statement, a testament to the decades he had spent being talked about rather than listened to. When Judge Margaret Vance took the bench, her expression was grim, reflecting the immense gravity of a case that threatened to expose systemic failures reaching back through 3 generations of local law enforcement. The reading of the charges was a long, clinical recitation of horror. Darren Miller stood at the defense table, his hands loosely clasped in front of his orange jumpsuit, listening to the prosecutor detail the specifics of first-degree murder, kidnapping, and the unlawful concealment of human remains. The state's attorney, a sharp, methodical woman named Sarah Jenkins, did not lean into sensationalism. She let the dry, technical facts build the wall around the defendant. She introduced the genomic sequencing data into the record, describing the specific somatic mutations found on the window latch as a genetic fingerprint unique to the defendant and the defendant alone. As the technical terminology filled the room, base pairs, deep sequencing, post-zygotic variances, the crowd began to realize that the old era of criminal investigation, defined by hunches and circumstantial timelines, had been decisively crushed by the unyielding precision of modern science. When asked for his plea, Darren Miller looked directly at the judge. His voice, when it came, was surprisingly clear, devoid of the gravelly tremor one might expect from a 60-year-old man facing the rest of his life behind bars. "Guilty, Your Honor," he said, the words falling into the silent courtroom like lead weights. The defense attorney beside him closed his folder with a quiet sigh. There had been no negotiation, no attempt to bargain for a lesser charge. Darren had reportedly told his legal team that he had no interest in an extended trial that would dissect his post-1986 life in front of the public. He had played his game. He had won for 40 years, and now that the board had been flipped, he had no desire to waste energy on a losing hand. The immediate plea meant there would be no multi-week trial, no parade of witnesses reliving the trauma of 1986, but it also meant the public would be denied the spectacle of a full cross-examination that might explain the why behind the cruelty. The immediate transition from arraignment to the sentencing phase allowed the prosecutor to read the victim impact statements into the record, providing a heartbreaking voice to the family that had been broken by Darren's actions. Karen Vance's brother, Thomas, who was only 12 when she disappeared, stood at the podium with a trembling piece of paper. He described how his parents had died young, their hearts literally worn out by the endless stress of the unresolved disappearance, their home transformed into a shrine of grief, where the phone was never allowed to be occupied for more than 5 minutes in case Karen was trying to call. "You didn't just kill Karen," Thomas said, his eyes locked onto the profile of the man in the orange jumpsuit. "You killed my mother's smile. You killed my father's ambition. You turned our entire family history into a true crime story that we could never escape. And the worst part is, we watched you comfort them at the funeral. We let you hug us." Darren did not flinch during the statement. He remained perfectly still, his eyes fixed on the mahogany paneling behind the judge's bench, his face an unreadable mask of absolute emotional vacuum. This lack of reaction seemed to agitate the gallery more than a violent outburst would have. It confirmed that the man sitting before them was completely insulated from the normal human frequencies of guilt, shame, or empathy. The state psychologists who had interviewed him in the days prior noted that Darren possessed an extraordinary ability to mimic normal cognitive functions while entirely lacking effective resonance. He understood that Thomas was angry and sad, but he viewed that anger and sadness as a natural, mechanical consequence of a system reboot rather than a profound human tragedy that he had authored. The judge, before pronouncing the sentence, spent 10 minutes addressing the systemic failure that had allowed the case to remain cold for so long. She did not spare the original detectives, many of whom were now deceased or long retired. The record shows that law enforcement in 1986 suffered from a fatal disease called tunnel vision, Judge Vance stated, her voice echoing off the concrete walls. They found a suspect who was quiet, who was vulnerable, and who fit their preconceived notions of a troubled soul, and they stopped looking. They allowed their own biases to build a protective wall around the true predator. This court cannot restore the 40 years stolen from David Miller, nor can it bring back Karen Vance. But it can ensure that the man responsible for this monumental cruelty never sees the sky as a free man again. The sentence was exactly what the state had demanded: true life in prison without the possibility of parole, to be served at the maximum security facility in Salem. As Darren was led out of the courtroom, a small commotion occurred near the back of the gallery. An elderly woman, who had lived down the street from the Miller brothers when they were boys, stood up and cried out, "Why, Darren, why did you do it to your own brother?" Darren paused for a fraction of a second, his head turning slightly toward the crowd, his eyes scanning the faces of his former neighbors. For a brief moment, it looked as though he might speak, that he might offer some final, cryptic insight into the lifelong deception. But the deputies nudged him forward, and he disappeared through the heavy metal door, the latch clicking shut with a finality that signaled the end of his public existence. The aftermath of the sentencing left the town in a state of emotional decompression. The satellite trucks began packing up their dishes, the reporters moved on to the next national sensation, and the courthouse steps returned to their normal, quiet routine. But for the people of the valley, the story was far from over. The revelation that Darren had buried Karen beneath the roots of an old-growth cedar had triggered a massive investigation by the State Forestry Department and historical societies, who were now attempting to map the exact locations of Darren's work assignments during his decades as a timber consultant. The fear that he had used his intimate knowledge of the state's wilderness to hide other crimes hung over the region like a persistent fog. Investigators began reviewing missing persons reports from the late 1980s and early 1990s, looking for patterns that matched Darren's travelogues, realized that the 40-year cold case might simply be the first chapter in a much larger, darker volume. In the days following the sentencing, a quiet movement began among some of the town's older residents to make amends with David Miller. A small group, led by a retired schoolteacher who had known the twins in high school, drove out to David's isolated property with the intention of offering a formal, collective apology. They carried a basket of home-cooked food and a letter signed by dozens of local citizens expressing their deep regret for the decades of isolation they had imposed upon him. When they pulled into the gravel driveway, they found the house completely dark. The old hunting dog was gone from the porch, and the vintage tools that had sat in the yard for decades had been meticulously cleared away. Attached to the front door was a small, typed note from a real estate attorney indicating that the property had been sold to a timber management firm and that the previous occupant had relocated outside the state, leaving no forwarding address. David Miller had vanished as completely as Karen Vance had 40 years earlier, but this time, it was an act of deliberate choice. He had waited until the system officially cleared his name, until the truth was etched into the court records, and then he had simply walked away from the valley that had destroyed him. He did not want their late-stage apologies, their awkward encounters at the post office, or the burden of being the town's living reminder of their own cruelty. He had chosen anonymity, moving to a place where his face would not trigger whispers, where his name would not be linked to a horrific headline, and where he could finally live out the remainder of his days without the shadow of his brother's face watching him from every mirror. The valley was left with the empty cabin, the filled-in grave beneath the old cedar, and the permanent, chilling realization that the greatest deception in their history had been executed not by a stranger from the highway, but by the twin who shared their life, their blood, and their silence. The departure of David Miller from the valley did not heal the wound left behind. Instead, it transformed the empty house into a silent, accusatory monument. For months after his disappearance into the vast, anonymous expanse of the American West, the gravel driveway of his former property remained clear of tire tracks, save for the occasional real estate agent or curiosity seeker. The local children, who had once been warned by their parents to avoid the weird mechanic's house at the edge of the timberline, now looked at the vacant structure with a different kind of dread. They understood, in the instinctual way children do, that the true horror had not been the man inside, but the collective malice of the town that had kept him trapped there. The house sat as a physical manifestation of a community's guilt, its peeling paint and overgrown lawn serving as a stark reminder of 40 years spent hounding an innocent soul while a killer slept soundly in a warm bed just a few miles away. In the maximum security confines of the Oregon State Penitentiary in Salem, Darren Miller began his new existence with the seamless adaptability of a true parasite. To the prison staff, he was an anomaly, a model inmate who never complained about the food, never ran afoul of the guards, and never participated in the tribal politics of the yard. He was assigned a job in the institutional laundry, where he spent his days operating the massive industrial dryers, his face obscured by the clouds of hot steam, his movements as rhythmic and mechanical as they had been at the hardware store. When prison psychologists attempted to schedule follow-up interviews to delve deeper into the mechanics of his 40-year deception, Darren politely but firmly declined. He had given the state his confession, he had directed them to the bones beneath the cedar, and as far as he was concerned, his contract with the public was fulfilled. The curtain had fallen on his performance, and he had no interest in providing a post-mortem commentary for the benefit of academic research. Meanwhile, the ripples of the case began to destabilize other cold case investigations across the Pacific Northwest. The unique nature of the forensic breakthrough, the utilization of ultra-deep whole genome sequencing to differentiate between identical twins via post-zygotic somatic mutations, had created a powerful legal and scientific precedent. District attorneys from Seattle to San Francisco began auditing their archives for unresolved homicides where identical twins had been ruled out or left uncharged due to the limitations of standard STR DNA testing. In Portland, a 30-year-old unsolved abduction case involving a young nursing student was officially reopened when investigators realized that the primary suspect, who had been cleared because his twin brother provided a rock-solid workplace alibi, could now be subjected to the same genetic scrutiny that had brought down Darren Miller. The scientific community found itself in a frenzy of activity, with forensic labs across the globe rushing to publish papers on the Miller mutation paradigm, transforming a small-town tragedy into a cornerstone of modern criminal jurisprudence. Back in the Valley, the Vance family attempted to find a rhythm of life that did not revolve around the central gravity of a missing daughter. Thomas Vance, now the sole keeper of his family's legacy, spent the spring of 2026 dismantling the shrine that had occupied his parents' living room for 40 years. He boxed up the old newspaper clippings, the faded flyers with Karen's high school graduation photo, and the volumes of notes his father had kept on every local resident who had ever looked at Karen sideways. It was an agonizing process, akin to a second burial. As he carried the heavy boxes to the backyard incinerator, Thomas realized that the resolution of the cold case had not brought the profound, cinematic sense of peace he had been promised by television dramas. The truth had arrived, but it was a cold, sharp instrument that left its own kind of scar. His sister was dead, his parents were gone, and the man who had stolen them all was merely an old man eating a tray of institutional food in a concrete box 60 miles away. The physical landscape of the crime itself was also changing. The timber management firm that had purchased David Miller's property wasted no time in clearing the land, eager to erase the historical taint of the cold case and extract the commercial value from the timber. Within weeks, the heavy logging equipment arrived, their roaring diesel engines shattering the quiet of the mountain air. The ancient pines that had witnessed Karen's final night, the gravel driveway where her car had sat frozen in time, and the small wooden porch where David had endured 40 years of silent isolation were systematically ground into mulch and hauled away on the backs of flatbed trucks. The earth was turned over, the topsoil scraped clean, and a monoculture of commercial Douglas fir seedlings was planted in neat, geometric rows. To a casual driver passing through the mountain pass, there was no longer any indication that a historic crime had occurred there, no sign that a lifetime of deception had been anchored to that specific coordinate of latitude and longitude. Yet, despite the erasure of the physical landmarks, the psychological weight of the case remained embedded in the town's social fabric. The local tavern, where loggers and mill workers had gathered for generations to drink domestic beer and talk about the timber prices, became a quieter place. The boisterous arguments and casual gossip that had once defined the establishment were replaced by an uneasy reticence. Every person over the age of 50 looked at their contemporaries with a subtle, unvoiced question in their eyes. What did you say about David back then? How quickly did you throw him to the wolves? The town had been unmasked to itself, forced to confront the reality that their collective moral compass had been entirely steered by a psychopath's design. The realization bred a lingering, toxic distrust that poisoned old friendships and made the community feel smaller, tighter, and more defensive against the outside world. As the summer of 2026 approached, a new investigative development threatened to shatter the fragile calm that the Valley was attempting to cultivate. A retired surveyor for the State Forestry Department, prompted by the news of Darren Miller's arrest, came forward to the state police with a detailed logbook from the summer of 1991. The logbook documented an undocumented land clearing operation in a remote section of the Siuslaw National Forest, an area that had been under Darren's supervision during his time as a freelance timber consultant. According to the surveyor, Darren had insisted on altering the boundary lines of a planned logging road, citing a bogus environmental protection order regarding a non-existent nesting site of a protected bird species. At the time, the surveyor had thought nothing of it, chalking it up to bureaucratic interference, but in the light of the 1986 confession, the sudden detour took on a terrifying significance. The Cold Case Unit, bolstered by their recent success, immediately organized a covert reconnaissance of the 1991 site. The territory was far more rugged than the old-growth cedar grave where Karen had been found. It was a vertical landscape of jagged shale, thick salmonberry brambles, and treacherous ravines that had remained untouched by commercial logging for half a century. A team of state police detectives, accompanied by specialized ground-penetrating radar technicians, spent a week hacking their way through the wilderness, guided only by the faded coordinates in the surveyor's old logbook. The atmospheric conditions mirrored the grim reality of the investigation: low-hanging mist, a constant, saturating drizzle that turned the shale into a slick hazard, and a silence so profound that the snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot. On the fourth day of the search, the ground-penetrating radar flagged an anomaly beneath a massive outcropping of basalt rock, 3 miles from the nearest abandoned logging road. The digital readout indicated an unnatural disturbance in the soil strata, a 3 by 6 foot anomaly that lay 4 feet beneath the stone shelf. The excavation began under emergency protocols, with the team using hand tools to avoid damaging any potential evidence trapped in the earth. As they cleared away the centuries of decomposing fern fronds and broken stone, the smell of old, undisturbed earth filled the mountain air, carrying with it the cold, metallic dread that every homicide investigator recognizes. 6 feet down, buried beneath a layer of quicklime that had failed to completely destroy the evidence due to the high acidity of the forest soil, they found the skeletal remains of a second victim. The individual was small-framed, estimated to be a young female in her late teens or early 20s, her wrists bound behind her back with the same heavy-duty industrial zip ties that Darren Miller had used in his work as a heavy equipment mechanic. There was no identification, no jewelry, and no clothing left intact, save for a pair of leather hiking boots that had resisted the rot of the damp earth. The discovery was a catastrophic validation of the state's worst fears. Darren Miller had not been a one-time offender driven by a singular, obsessive jealousy of his brother's life. He was a systematic predator who had used the vast, unmapped wilderness of the Pacific Northwest as his private cemetery, confident that his shared identity with an innocent man would provide a permanent, biological immunity from prosecution. The news of the second body broke over the state like a second thunderclap, instantly destroying any hope that the Miller case could be neatly filed away as a historical anomaly. The media circus returned with an intensified fervor, the headlines screaming of a twin serial killer and demanding to know how many more secrets were buried in the millions of acres of public forest land. The state police immediately established a multi-agency task force, drawing in federal assets from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit to construct a comprehensive geographic and temporal timeline of Darren Miller's entire adult life. Every hour of his existence from 1978 to 2024 was subjected to a microscopic audit. Fuel receipts, credit card statements, hunting permits, lodging logs, and maintenance records were fed into a centralized database, creating a digital map of a monster's movements across 5 decades. In his cell in Salem, Darren was presented with the photographs of the newly discovered remains. The lead detective on the task force, an experienced investigator who had spent his career tracking serial offenders, watched Darren's face closely as the glossy prints were laid out on the metal table. For the first time since his arrest, Darren's expression changed. It was not a look of fear or remorse, but a subtle, flickering irritation, the look of a craftsman who realizes that a forgotten mistake has compromised an otherwise flawless piece of work. He looked at the leather boots in the photograph, took a slow, deep breath, and leaned back in his plastic chair, his eyes drifting toward the small, high window that offered a view of the gray Oregon sky. "You're making a lot of work for yourselves," Darren said, his voice dropping into that chilling, conversational register that had become his trademark in the interrogation room. "The woods out there are big. You could look for 100 years and never find the rest of them. The statement was a casual confirmation of a nightmare, an admission that the valley had only seen the edge of the shadow that had walked among them for 40 years. The realization that the quiet family man who had attended their backyard barbecues was a prolific, calculating predator transformed the 1986 cold case from a local tragedy into an ongoing, open-ended horror story that would haunt the entire state for generations to come, a testament to the absolute darkness that can hide behind the most familiar face in the world. The implication of Darren Miller's casual, devastating admission hung in the sterile air of the visitation room like a toxic vapor. You could look for 100 years and never find the rest of them. With those 12 words, the scope of the Oregon 1986 cold case expanded from a localized domestic tragedy into a sprawling, multi-jurisdictional nightmare that stretched back across the decades. The newly formed task force, operating out of a secure wing at the state police headquarters in Salem, found themselves staring at a map of the Pacific Northwest that was suddenly lit up with dozens of red pins, each representing an unsolved disappearance, an unidentified set of remains, or a missing hitchhiker along the coastal highways between 1980 and 2010. The realization was sickening. For 40 years, law enforcement had not just been protecting the wrong man by hounding David Miller, they had effectively granted an active, highly organized serial predator a lifetime pass to hunt in the deep timberlands of the West. The scientific victory that had cracked the initial case, the identification of the unique somatic mutations that separated Darren from his twin brother, now faced an entirely different challenge. The problem was no longer proving that Darren was a killer. The problem was tracking a ghost who had spent his entire life mastering the art of leaving no trace. Unlike the 1986 murder of Karen Vance, which had been driven by an explosive, deeply personal cocktail of jealousy and obsession, the second recovery in the Siuslaw National Forest suggested a much more clinical, detached methodology. The use of quicklime to accelerate decomposition and the selection of an area so remote it required a surveyor's logbook to relocate demonstrated that Darren had developed a highly sophisticated disposal routine. He understood the chemistry of the forest floor, the acidic nature of the soil, the scavenging habits of the local wildlife, and the blind spots of regional satellite tracking. As the task force dug deeper into Darren's employment records from his years as a heavy equipment mechanic and timber consultant, a terrifying pattern began to emerge. His job required him to travel to remote, unmapped logging sites long before the commercial crews arrived. He was often the first person on the ground, tasked with assessing the terrain, clearing initial brush, and setting up staging areas for the massive industrial machinery. This gave him unchecked, unmonitored access to thousands of square miles of dense forest land, completely insulated from public view. He knew which roads were gated, which trails were abandoned, and where the state forestry department rarely patrolled. He was a professional woodsman who used his trade as a cover for a predatory migration, shifting his hunting grounds from the coastal ranges to the high deserts of eastern Oregon depending on the season and the density of the logging contracts. The psychological impact on the small town where the twins had grown up reached a fever pitch during the summer of 2026. The community could no longer pretend that the tragedy was an isolated incident from a bygone era. It was an ongoing horror story that was actively dismantling their history. The local high school, which both brothers had attended, found itself under scrutiny when investigators discovered that two young women from the graduating classes of 1981 and 1983 had vanished within months of graduation, their cases originally handled as runaway incidents by a sheriff's department that assumed young girls simply wanted to escape the stagnation of a dying mill town. Now, 40 years later, those old folders were pulled from the dusty bottom drawers of the county archive, their yellowed pages containing names that Darren Miller had undoubtedly known, faces he had passed in the narrow corridors of the old schoolhouse. In the midst of this escalating crisis, the task force made a critical tactical decision. They needed to find David Miller. Although he had successfully erased his presence from the valley, selling his property and cutting all ties with his former neighbors, his institutional knowledge of his brother was an untapped resource. If anyone understood the subtle shifts in Darren's behavior over the last 40 years, the sudden, unexplained road trips, the late-night returns with mud on his boots, the moments of uncharacteristic anger or unsettling calm. It was the twin who had shared his genetic blueprint. But tracking David proved to be an extraordinary challenge. He had not simply moved to a new town. He had deliberately gone off the grid, utilizing the financial proceeds from his land sale to disappear into the vast, unincorporated territories of the American interior, living under a legal name change that had been sealed by a sympathetic judge who recognized the mortal danger of his situation. The search for David led a pair of veteran state detectives to a remote, wind-scoured valley in northern Wyoming, far from the damp, suffocating forests of his youth. They found him living in a modest, solar-powered cabin at the end of a long dirt track, surrounded by sagebrush and the jagged peaks of the Absaroka Range. He was working as a blacksmith, spending his days shaping raw iron in the heat of a forge, his hands calloused and his face weathered by the harsh mountain sun. When the detectives pulled into his yard, their unmarked SUV kicking up a plume of white dust, David did not look up from his anvil. He completed his strike, plunged the glowing metal into a barrel of water with a sharp, angry hiss, and only then did he turn his eyes toward the intruders. The conversation that followed on the cabin porch was not one of cooperation, but of a profound, ancient exhaustion. David listened in silence as the detectives detailed the discovery of the second body in the Siuslaw National Forest and Darren's chilling boast about the size of his private cemetery. He did not look surprised. He sat with his elbows resting on his knees, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the hawks were circling over the canyon. When the detectives asked him to return to Oregon to assist the behavioral analysts in mapping Darren's early movements, David let out a low, bitter laugh that sounded like dry leaves scraping over concrete. "You spent 40 years telling me I was a monster," David said, his voice dropping into a register that was hauntingly similar to his brother's, yet devoid of the cold calculation that defined Darren's speech. "You watched me drown in your suspicion. You let my business rot. You let my friends treat me like a leper, and you let the woman I loved rot in the dirt while he sat at my dinner table. And now you want me to help you fix your mistakes? You want me to go back to that valley and look at his face again? I died in 1986, detective. The man sitting in front of you is just what's left after the fire." Despite his initial resistance, the detectives played their final, heaviest card. They showed him the photograph of the silver locket recovered from the root system of the old-growth cedar, the locket containing his own faded photograph, which Karen Vance had carried into the dark. David took the picture from the detective's hand, his fingers trembling slightly as he stared at the waterlogged, corroded piece of silver. For the first time in the decades since his world had ended, the stoic mask cracked, and a single, heavy tear traced a line through the soot on his cheek. He did not say yes, but he did not say no. He told the detectives to leave him for the night, promising nothing but a decision by sunrise. While the detectives waited in a dingy motel 20 miles away, the state lab in Oregon completed the initial forensic assessment of the skeletal remains found at the second site. The results were preliminary but devastating. DNA extracted from the femur of the victim did not match any missing person's profile in the state database, indicating that she was likely an out-of-state traveler, a transient, or someone whose disappearance had never been formally reported by a family that assumed she had simply broken contact. The use of quicklime had severely degraded the fragile mitochondrial DNA, requiring the technicians to initiate the same intensive, ultra-deep whole genome sequencing that had cracked the Vance case. The lab became a high-security bunker, with scientists working in rotating 12-hour shifts under the watchful eye of state police guards, knowing that every base pair they decoded could be the key to unlocking a different family's multi-decade nightmare. Back in Salem, Darren Miller's routine within the prison did not alter a fraction despite the new allegations against him. He continued his work in the laundry, his behavior so impeccable that the prison administration had no legal grounds to place him in administrative segregation, despite the intense media pressure surrounding his status. He seemed to draw a quiet, internal nourishment from the chaos erupting outside the walls, watching the television reports in the day room with a detached appreciation of a retired director watching a revival of his old play. He knew that every time a police spokesperson stepped in front of a microphone to announce a new search area or a new historical lead, they were acknowledging his supreme authorship of the state's dark history. He had transformed himself from a mundane hardware consultant into an immortal enigma, a shadow that covered the entire history of the Pacific Northwest. At dawn the next morning in Wyoming, the detectives returned to David Miller's cabin. They found him standing by his pickup truck, a single canvas duffel bag resting in the truck bed. He did not say a word as they approached. He simply climbed into the driver's seat, started the engine, and motioned for them to lead the way to the airport. He was returning to Oregon, not out of a sense of civic duty, and certainly not to assist the system that had betrayed him, but to face the genetic ghost that had hunted in his skin for 40 years. The stage was set for a confrontation that defied the boundaries of legal history, a meeting of two identical structures, one carrying the absolute weight of innocent suffering and the other carrying the icy, calculated malice of a lifetime spent killing in the dark. The return of David Miller to the state of Oregon was conducted under conditions of absolute operational secrecy. The task force knew that if the media caught wind of the innocent twins' arrival, the courthouse and the state police headquarters would be instantly paralyzed by a secondary wave of journalistic hysteria. He was flown into a private hangar at the McNary Field Airport in Salem under an assumed manifest, stepped directly into the back of a blacked-out transport SUV, and was driven straight to the high-security administrative annex of the state police facility. As the vehicle moved through the valley, passing the familiar exits that led back to the timberlands of his youth, David sat in total silence, his eyes fixed on the gray wall of fog that hung low over the Willamette River. He was a man re-entering his own graveyard, surrounded by the ghosts of a life that had been systematically hijacked before it ever had a chance to begin. The strategy developed by the behavioral analysts was high-risk and experimental. They had quickly realized that Darren Miller was entirely immune to standard interrogation techniques. He did not respond to appeals for closure. He laughed at threats of solitary confinement, and he took a clinical pleasure in watching the detectives chase their tails through the thousands of acres of unmapped forest. But the analysts noted that Darren's entire psychological construct was built upon the absolute dominance and manipulation of his identical twin. For 50 years, Darren had viewed David not as a brother, but as a biological vessel designed to absorb his darkness, a living shield that granted him total immunity. The team believed that the only presence capable of shattering Darren's absolute composure, the only mirror that could force a fracture in his sociopathic equilibrium, was the face he had stolen. The meeting was set for a windowless briefing room deep within the basement of the state facility, rather than the standard visitation room at the penitentiary. The room was divided by a heavy oak table with no glass partition, creating an uncomfortably intimate arena for the genetic reckoning. When Darren was brought in, his ankles shackled and his wrists secured to a waist chain, he maintained his usual rhythmic, unhurried pace. He sat down in the steel chair, his eyes tracking the movement of the guards as they stepped back toward the perimeter wall. And then he looked across the table. For the first time in over a decade, the two men who shared 99.99% of their physical reality were in the same room. The visual contrast between the twins was a physical manifestation of two completely different life paths born from the exact same beginning. Darren, despite his prison jumpsuit and his incarceration, looked remarkably preserved. His skin was smooth, his hands uncalloused from a lifetime of respectable white-collar consulting, his posture carrying the quiet confidence of a man who had won his life's gamble. David, sitting opposite him, looked like an artifact pulled from the earth. His skin was deeply lined by the wind and sun of the Wyoming high desert, his shoulders were heavy and stooped from years of manual labor at the forge, and his hands were scarred, thick, and stained with the gray grease of ironwork. Yet, their eyes were identical, the same specific, piercing shade of flint gray, looking back at each other like an echo frozen in ice. For 3 long minutes, neither man spoke. The silence in the room became so heavy that the low hum of the fluorescent lights above grew deafening. Darren's eyes traveled over his brother's weathered face, his lips twitching into the ghost of that familiar, unsettling smile. He seemed to be cataloging the damage, measuring the exact depth of the ruin he had inflicted upon his twin's life with the satisfaction of a master builder inspecting a completed project. "You look old, David," Darren said, his voice breaking the silence with a smooth, conversational ease that made the observing detectives behind the two-way glass turn cold. "The mountain air out east doesn't seem to suit you. You should have stayed in the valley. The rain keeps a man young." David did not flinch. He did not lean forward, nor did he allow his voice to rise with the decades of fury that everyone in the room expected to erupt. He remained perfectly still, his scarred hands flat on the oak table, his gray eyes locked onto his brother's pupils with an unyielding, terrifying focus. "I spent 40 years wondering why the world hated me, Darren," David said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried the weight of the Wyoming winter. "I spent 40 years looking in the mirror every morning, trying to see the monster that everyone else saw when I walked down the street. I thought maybe I was crazy. I thought maybe I had done it in my sleep, that there was a piece of my mind that was broken, that had gone out into the dark and killed Karen without me knowing it. But looking at you now, I see the truth. The mirror wasn't broken. You were just standing behind it." Darren laughed, a quiet, breathy sound that didn't reach his eyes. "The mirror was perfect, David. That was the beauty of it. We were the perfect design. If they found a skin cell, it was you. If they saw a silhouette, it was you. If they needed someone to hate, it was always you. You were the best thing that ever happened to me. You were the reason I could sleep at night because I knew that whatever I did out in the timber, my face was already home in bed, working the night shift at the garage." "And the others?" David asked, his voice dropping an octave, leaning slightly closer to the center of the table. "The girl in the Siuslaw forest. The others you told the detectives they'd never find. Who were they, Darren? Did you tell them my name before you put them in the dirt? Did you let them think it was me too?" The question struck a precise, hidden nerve in Darren's psychological armor. His smile faded slightly, his eyes narrowing as he detected a shift in the power dynamic. He had expected David to be broken, to weep, to demand an explanation or an apology that he could withhold with sadistic pleasure. He had not expected this cold, clinical cross-examination from a man he had spent his life treating as a lesser extension of himself. "They didn't need a name, David," Darren said coldly, his posture stiffening against the chains. "They were just travelers, girls from the highway, people who didn't belong to the valley. They were like the logging tracks, just material to be cleared out before the crews arrived. I didn't need to use your name with them, because they didn't know who we were. But the system used your name for me every single day. Every time the sheriff's car drove past my shop and went straight to your house, that was you saving my life. You've been saving me since 1986. "I didn't save you," David replied, his voice rising with a slow, volcanic intensity that filled the small room. "The science caught you. The piece of dust you left on Karen's window, the piece you thought was yours, it wasn't yours. It had your name written inside it, Darren. The tiny mistakes your body made after we split in the womb. The things you couldn't control, the things you couldn't plan for, the tiny mutations that make you different from me. You thought you were a ghost, but your own blood turned state's evidence against you." The mention of the somatic mutations, the specific, undeniable scientific reality that had destroyed his perfect deception, caused a visible ripple of anger to cross Darren's features. His hands clenched into fists, the metal chains rattling sharply against the table leg. He had prided himself on his intellect, on his absolute mastery of the environment and the timeline, and to be reminded that his downfall was caused by a microscopic, biological accident that he had no power to prevent was an intolerable insult to his vanity. "It's a parlor trick," Darren hissed, his conversational tone completely vanishing, replaced by a raw, vicious arrogance. "A computer program looking at dust. It doesn't change the 40 years, David. It doesn't give you back your 20s or your 30s or the family you never had. I took all of it. I ate your life, brother. I lived it, I enjoyed it, and there isn't a judge or a laboratory in the world that can make me throw it back up. You can sit there with your scarred hands and your lonely cabin, but we both know who won the game." David looked down at his own hands, his fingers tracing the faint white lines of old burns from the forge. A strange, quiet calm settled over his face, A look that the detectives behind the glass realized was the absolute end of Darren's power over him. "You think you won because you stayed out of a cage for 40 years, David said softly, looking back up into his brother's furious face. "But you've been in a cage since the night you went through that window. You had to watch me every day. You had to make sure I didn't leave, make sure I didn't die, make sure I didn't do something that would change the timeline. You were chained to me, Darren. You built your whole life around my shadow. Every time you kissed your children, every time you looked at your wife, you had to ask yourself if today was the day the world looked at the other brother. You didn't live a life. You just managed an alibi." David stood up from the table, his chair scraping loudly against the concrete floor. He did not wait for Darren to respond. He did not look back as he walked toward the heavy steel door, signaling the guards to open it. He had seen what he came to see, not a master manipulator who had beaten the system, but a small, desperate predator whose entire existence was now shrinking down to the dimensions of a maximum security cell, completely stripped of the identity he had spent a lifetime stealing. As the door clicked shut behind David, Darren lunged forward against his chains, his face distorted with a sudden, uncontrolled rage, shouting a curse that was swallowed by the sound of the deadbolts sliding into place. In the observation room, the lead behavioral analyst turned to the task force director and nodded. The fracture had occurred. Within 48 hours, isolated in the silence of his containment cell and stripped of his illusion of superiority, Darren Miller requested a yellow legal pad and a pen, indicating that he was finally ready to provide the coordinates for the rest of the graves. The ink on the yellow legal pad was the color of dried blood, a scratching, erratic script that transformed the vast topography of the Pacific Northwest into a highly organized ledger of death. Darren Miller sat alone in the isolation cell of the administrative annex, his analytical mind stripped of its human shield, now focusing its terrifying efficiency entirely on the task of documentation. He did not write out of remorse or a sudden spiritual awakening. He wrote because his grand illusion of victory had been dismantled by the simple, quiet dignity of his brother's survival. If he could no longer be the invisible ghost who had beaten the system, he would become the historical architect of its greatest horror. For 3 consecutive nights, the pen never stopped moving, mapping out coordinates, drawing detailed sketches of mountain passes, and listing the approximate dates of an unrecognized predatory campaign that had spanned over 30 years. The task force room at the state police headquarters was transformed into a tactical war room, its walls covered in giant topographical maps of the Cascade Range and the coastal forests. As each page of the legal pad was scanned and transmitted from the jail, detectives used red thread to connect the coordinates to long-dormant missing persons files. The precision of the data was staggering. Darren had not merely dumped his victims. He had engineered their disappearances with the same calculated, spatial awareness he had used to hide Karen Vance. He noted the exact soil conditions, the depth of the water tables, the proximity to historical logging access roads that had since been reclaimed by the wilderness, and the specific seasonal variations that would minimize the chance of accidental discovery by hunters or forestry workers. The first set of coordinates led the recovery teams to a forgotten patch of state timberland just north of the Columbia River Gorge, an area that had been heavily logged in the mid-1980s and subsequently abandoned. The environment was an impenetrable fortress of Devil's Club, rotting nurse logs, and second-growth hemlock that choked out the sun. Guided by Darren's sketch, which featured a prominent, lightning-struck cedar stump as its primary landmark, a specialized excavation unit worked through a weekend under a relentless, blinding downpour. 4 feet beneath the forest floor, encased in the same industrial plastic sheeting Darren used to protect heavy machinery parts from rust, they recovered the remains of a young woman who had vanished from a Portland transit station in the summer of 1989. Her identification card, remarkably preserved within the airtight seal of the plastic, bore the name of a 19-year-old student whose parents had died decades prior, still believing she had simply run away to begin a new life in California. Back in the valley that had birthed the horror, the local population lived in a state of suspended, collective trauma. Every morning brought a fresh set of headlines detailing a new recovery site, a new identity restored to the missing, and a new confirmation of the monster who had walked their streets. The small hardware supply store where Darren had worked for years became a crime scene in its own right, as federal agents executed search warrants on the store's archive computers, seeking to determine if he had used the company's logistics databases to track the movements of solitary customers or to identify remote properties that were ripe for infiltration. The current employees, many of whom had shared coffee with Darren in the break room for over a decade, sat on the curb outside the store, their heads in their hands, paralyzed by the realization that the friendly, technical expert who had helped them choose the right tools for their homes had been using his own knowledge to build a kingdom of shadows. As the body count attributed to Darren Miller climbed into the double digits, the focus of the forensic community shifted heavily toward the specialized laboratory in California that had initiated the breakthrough. The ultra-deep whole genome sequencing that had isolated the somatic point mutations was no longer viewed as an experimental novelty. It was recognized as a revolutionary weapon that could permanently alter the landscape of cold case investigation. The laboratory was inundated with requests from international law enforcement agencies, all seeking to apply the Miller mutation protocol to ancient, unresolved crimes involving identical twins. The scientists who had decoded the window latch found themselves working under intense global scrutiny, knowing that their work had not only solved a 40-year-old murder, but had inadvertently pulled the plug on a historic, biological deception that had allowed a serial killer to operate with absolute immunity. The psychological toll on the task force members was immense. Day after day, they were forced to listen to the recordings of Darren's supplementary interviews, where he described the logistics of his crimes with the flat, emotionless precision of a software engineer explaining a line of code. He did not display malice. He displayed an absolute, terrifying vacuum of human feeling. He viewed the young women he had taken not as human beings with dreams and families, but as temporary logistical problems that required a permanent, spatial solution. The behavioral analysts from the FBI noted that Darren's sociopathy was entirely anchored to his identity as a twin. He had spent his entire life believing that he was above the law because he possessed a genetic duplicate who could absorb the moral and legal consequences of his actions. His brother's existence had served as a permanent, psychological get-out-of-jail-free card, allowing him to indulge his darkest impulses without ever experiencing the human sensation of fear or accountability. In the midst of the recovery operations, a quiet, monumental legal process was unfolding in a closed courtroom in Salem. A state judge officially signed the decree vacating every historical police report, every investigative file, and every formal citation that had linked David Miller to the disappearance of Karen Vance. The state issued a public, unvarnished apology to David, acknowledging that the system's early reliance on confirmation bias and tunnel vision had effectively executed a slow, 40-year destruction of an innocent citizen's life. The document was a historic piece of judicial self-flagellation, but it was delivered to an empty courtroom. David Miller was not there to receive it. He had already returned to the windswept plains of northern Wyoming, his brief excursion into the valley of his youth completed, his identity restored but his soul permanently detached from the world that had broken him. The autumn of 2026 arrived with a bitter, early frost that turned the mountain passes into treacherous ribbons of black ice, forcing a temporary halt to the recovery operations in the higher elevations of the Cascades. The task force was forced to pause its physical searches, transitioning its focus to the massive digital archive they had constructed over the summer. They knew that the yellow legal pad was only a partial map. Darren's memory, while extraordinarily clinical, was subject to the natural erosion of time, and there were several entries where he could only provide a general mountain range or a rough year rather than precise coordinates. The detectives sat in the quiet of their offices, surrounded by the faces of the missing, understanding that the coming winter would hold the secrets tight beneath the snow, leaving dozens of families to wait through another dark season for the call that would finally bring their children home. The story of the Oregon 1986 cold case had evolved past the simple boundaries of true crime. It had become a profound, haunting meditation on the nature of identity, truth, and human cruelty. The empty cabin where Karen Vance had lived her final moments was gone, The old cedar tree had been ground into dust, and the twin who had committed the crime was locked away in a concrete box for the rest of his days. But the shadow he had cast over the valley remained unmoved, a permanent part of the landscape that could never be logged away or replanted. The community was left to navigate a world where the most terrifying monster was not a stranger waiting in the dark of the highway, but the familiar face that smiled back at you from the mirror, a genetic duplicate who could kill in your skin and leave you to pay the price for a lifetime of silence. The winter of 2026 descended upon the Pacific Northwest with a brutal, unyielding severity, burying the Cascade Range under 10 feet of dense, packed snow and bringing a forced, frozen silence to the recovery operations. The high-altitude logging roads, which had served as the arteries for the task force's grim summer investigations, were completely swallowed by the white expanse, rendered impassable to even the heaviest tracked equipment. In the valleys below, the relentless rains returned, saturating the lowlands and turning the remaining search areas into treacherous bogs of liquid clay. The physical hunt for Darren Miller's hidden cemeteries was officially paused by nature, but inside the brightly lit offices of the Lane County Sheriff's Department and the FBI's Regional Field Office, the analytical war continued, without a moment of respite. The pause in field operations allowed the behavioral analysts and digital forensic experts to pivot toward an even more daunting challenge: decoding the gaps within Darren's yellow legal pad. While his early entries from the late 1980s and 1990s had been remarkably precise, anchored to specific topographical landmarks he had mapped out during his employment as a timber consultant, his later accounts from the mid-2000s exhibited an unsettling vagueness. The dates were fluid, the locations described only by broad territorial markers like the eastern slope of Mount Hood or the unincorporated public lands north of Bend. Investigators quickly realized that as Darren grew older and more confident in his absolute immunity, his internal bookkeeping had deteriorated. He no longer needed to meticulously plan the spatial mechanics of his disposals because the system had spent decades proving it would never look past his brother's face. He had become sloppy not out of fatigue, but out of supreme, arrogant security. To bridge these forensic chasms, the task force initiated a massive data mining operation, cross-referencing Darren's historical cell phone records, commercial fuel card transactions, and satellite toll receipts from 2002 to 2015. Every time his mobile device pinged a remote mountain tower, every time his truck refueled at an isolated high-desert oasis at 2 a.m, the data was plotted onto a massive digital timeline. The result was a terrifying visualization of a migratory predator's rhythm. The software revealed that Darren's long-distance movements across the state lines into Washington and Idaho were almost always accompanied by a corresponding, silent window of 48 to 72 hours where his phone went completely dark, turned off deliberately to avoid generating a digital trail while he navigated the unmapped gravel bypasses of the national forests. Meanwhile, the legal team preparing the secondary federal indictments faced a unique constitutional conundrum. Because Darren had already pled guilty to the 1986 murder of Karen Vance and had been sentenced to true life without parole under state law, the introduction of these newly discovered out-of-state victims required a complex nesting of federal kidnapping and civil rights charges to ensure that if a future state governor ever commuted his sentence, he would remain permanently trapped within the federal penitentiary system. The prosecutors worked in absolute secrecy, assembling a mountain of evidence that included the deep genome sequencing reports from the second recovery site in the Siuslaw Forest. The science that had broken the case was now the unyielding foundation of the entire prosecution. Every single indictment was anchored to those 3 specific somatic mutations, the microscopic signature that separated the killer from his innocent twin. In the maximum security wing of the state prison in Salem, the environment surrounding Darren Miller grew increasingly clinical. He had been moved from the general population laundry detail to an isolated administrative cell block, a precautionary measure taken after several high-profile inmates made threats against his life, driven by the media's daily exposure of his prolific crimes against young women. Stripped of his routine, Darren spent his winter days sitting at the small concrete desk in his cell, his posture rigid, his gray eyes staring out into the narrow corridor. The prison guards reported that he had stopped reading the true crime paperbacks he had previously favored. Instead, He requested an old, multi-volume set of standard encyclopedias, spending hours reading about geology, soil chemistry, and the natural history of the Pacific Northwest, as if he were reviewing the structural mechanics of the very earth that was currently keeping his remaining secrets safe from the police. The psychological impact on the surrounding communities had by now hardened into a permanent cultural cynicism. The initial shock of the twin brother deception had evolved into a deeper, more systemic anger directed at the older generation of law enforcement officers who had allowed the tunnel vision to fester. In early December, a group of local citizens filed a class action lawsuit against the county, demanding an independent audit of every single missing person case handled by the sheriff's office between 1980 and 1995. The public had come to realize that the structural failure was not merely an accident of early forensics, it was a cultural pathology. The detectives had wanted a simple domestic narrative, the jealous fiancé who snapped, and because David Miller's grief looked quiet and uncooperative, they had systematically ignored every piece of contradictory data that pointed toward the highway, effectively leaving the real monster free to hunt for 3 decades. For the Vance family, the winter brought a quiet, hollow sort of protection. Thomas Vance had successfully completed the sale of his parents' old home, moving away from the valley to a small town on the Oregon coast where the sound of the ocean could drown out the historical echoes of the logging trucks. He refused to watch the television news, he refused to take calls from the task force detectives, and he instructed his attorney to handle any future notifications regarding the recovery of Karen's personal artifacts. He had come to understand that the resolution of a cold case does not offer a restorative ending. It merely provides an ending that is clear, dry, and permanently devoid of hope. His sister was a collection of forensic data points in a state archive, her memory forever tethered to the scientific miracle that had unmasked her killer, while the real tragedy remained unmitigated by the passage of time or the clicking of handcuffs. As the year wound toward its close, the forensic laboratory in California achieved another massive breakthrough using the Miller mutation protocol. They had successfully extracted a clean genetic sequence from the degraded skeletal remains recovered from the basalt rock outcropping in the Siuslaw National Forest. The ultra-deep sequencing confirmed that the somatic point mutations matched Darren Miller with a mathematical certainty that excluded his brother entirely. But more importantly, when the profile was run through an expanded, international missing persons database that included data from Indigenous communities along the highway corridors of Western Canada, the system flagged an absolute match. The second victim was identified as a 21-year-old woman from the First Nations community of northern British Columbia who had vanished during a seasonal trip to visit relatives in Washington state in 1993. The confirmation of an out-of-state, international victim transformed the task force's mission from an Oregon investigation into a sprawling multinational operation. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, dispatched a liaison team to Salem, carrying with them dozens of unsolved files from the notorious Highway of Tears, a remote stretch of British Columbia's Highway 16 where dozens of women had vanished over the last 50 years. The Canadian investigators sat in the briefing room, looking at the digital map of Darren's commercial logging assignments, realizing with a cold certainty that his employment logs placed him in the immediate vicinity of 3 separate disappearances between 1994 and 1998. The network of shadows he had constructed was no longer a localized secret. It was a continental highway of violence that had utilized the border, the vast wilderness, and the perfect alibi of his brother's face to achieve total invisibility. On a freezing night in late December, an undercover detective working the night shift at the task force headquarters sat at his desk, staring at a side-by-side digital display of the twin brothers' historical photographs. On the left was David's mugshot from 1986, his face tight with shock, his eyes wide and hollowed out by the sudden, terrifying weight of public accusation. On the right was Darren's corporate portrait from a timber consulting brochure from the late 1990s, his face relaxed, his smile confident and warm, the picture of a successful, respected citizen. The detective realized that the ultimate horror of the case was not that the two men looked exactly alike. It was that the world had looked at the innocent face and seen a monster, while looking at the monster's face and seeing a neighbor. The system had been completely subverted by the surface of things, blinded by its own hunger for an easy answer, leaving the real predator to walk through the damp Oregon woods for 40 years, leaving a trail of bones that the winter snow was now working to hide forever. The arrival of January 2027 brought no relief to the frozen landscapes of the Pacific Northwest, nor did it slow the relentless momentum of the International Task Force. Inside the secure administrative wing in Salem, the investigation had entered a phase of bureaucratic warfare. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police Liaison Team, working alongside the FBI's behavioral analysts, had successfully mapped Darren Miller's commercial logging contracts against the dark timeline of British Columbia's Highway 16. The geographic correlation was undeniable. In the summers of 1994, 1996, and 1998, Darren had been hired by a multinational lumber conglomerate to survey remote old-growth tracts in the rugged interior of the province. Each of his deployments coincided perfectly with the unresolved disappearances of young women who had last been seen hitchhiking or walking along the isolated gravel shoulders of the Northern Highway. The logistical genius of Darren's operations lay in his ability to exploit the jurisdictional blind spots between two sovereign nations. In the mid-1990s, the border crossings between Washington State and British Columbia did not possess the integrated digital databases that characterize modern security infrastructure. An American commercial vehicle, driven by a man with a clean record and a valid corporate transport manifest, could cross the frontier with minimal scrutiny. Darren understood that if he committed a crime in Canada, the local authorities would look for a local suspect, never dreaming that the perpetrator was an American transit worker who would recross the border 48 hours later, returning to a quiet suburban life in Oregon where his twin brother provided a permanent, built-in biological alibi against any localized suspicion. To formalize these international findings, the federal prosecutors in Oregon initiated a complex grand jury proceeding, seeking a sweeping indictment for multi-jurisdictional kidnapping resulting in death. The legal strategy was designed to construct an unassailable wall of forensic certainty before the spring thaws allowed the recovery teams to return to the mountains. The state lab, working under emergency federal grants, began the exhaustive process of processing the secondary biological samples recovered from the Siuslaw forest outcropping. The technicians were no longer looking simply at standard DNA matching. They were utilizing advanced epigenetics to determine the exact environmental stressors that the victim had experienced in her final hours, seeking to establish a definitive timeline that would lock Darren into the crime scene beyond his verbal confession. In his isolation cell, Darren Miller's demeanor underwent a subtle, ominous transformation. The clinical detachment that had characterized his initial confession began to harden into a hostile, calculated reticence. He realized that the task force was no longer dependent on his yellow legal pad. The digital data mining, the satellite logs, and the international coordination had allowed the detectives to outpace his own memory. He had lost his status as the sole gatekeeper of the secrets, and this loss of control deeply wounded his psychopathic vanity. When the lead FBI interrogator attempted to question him regarding the specific coordinates of a 1996 disappearance in British Columbia, Darren remained perfectly silent, his flint gray eyes fixed on the blank concrete wall, his hands folded neatly in his lap like a retired executive refusing to participate in an exit interview. The psychological fallout within the valley reached a point of institutional reckoning as the county prepared for the upcoming judicial elections. The current district attorney, who had inherited the Vance file from a long line of career prosecutors, announced his resignation under intense public pressure. The community could no longer tolerate the defensive rhetoric that had shielded the department for 40 years. A grassroots movement, spearheaded by younger residents and civil rights advocates, demanded a complete overhaul of the regional cold case protocols, insisting that any unresolved homicide involving circumstantial evidence be subjected to immediate, independent scientific review by out-of-state laboratories. The town had come to recognize that their own historical hunger for an easy scapegoat had made them complicit in a 30-year campaign of violence, transforming their quiet valley into a sanctuary for a monster. For David Miller, the deep winter of northern Wyoming offered a harsh, cleansing sanctuary from the toxic atmosphere of his hometown. The news of the international expansion of the case reached him through his real estate attorney, but he refused to receive any official correspondence from the task force. He had done his part. He had sat across the table from his genetic ghost, looked into the eyes that shared his face, and stripped Darren of his psychological power. He spent his days in the intense, white heat of his forge, the rhythmic striking of his hammer against the raw iron serving as the only therapy that could quiet the echoes of his 40-year isolation. He had chosen to live as a silhouette, a man without a past or a future in the eyes of the public, content to let the wind and the sagebrush erase the last remnants of the identity his brother had poisoned. As the winter progressed toward late February, the digital forensics team achieved a critical breakthrough by decrypting an old, legacy hard drive that had been recovered from the basement of Darren's former suburban home. The drive, which dated back to the early 2000s, contained a hidden, encrypted folder that Darren had masked using obsolete industrial diagnostic software. When the specialists finally bypassed the security protocols, they found a collection of scanned highway maps, hand-drawn diagrams of Forest Service roads, and a series of short, clinical notes regarding the seasonal density of hitchhiker traffic along the Interstate 5 corridor. It was the definitive proof of premeditation, a digital blueprint of a predatory architecture that had been maintained with the same meticulous care an engineer would devote to a long-term infrastructure project. The discovery of the encrypted drive provided the final, necessary catalyst for the federal grand jury. On a cold morning in early March, the Department of Justice announced a 20-count indictment against Darren Miller, charging him with multiple counts of federal kidnapping, interstate transportation of stolen property associated with a homicide, and international violent crimes in aid of racketeering. The announcement was a historic milestone in federal law enforcement, marking the first time a serial offender had been indicted on a systemic scale based entirely on the application of ultra-deep whole genome sequencing to post-zygotic somatic mutations. The science had not merely solved a cold case, it had rewritten the rules of federal prosecution, ensuring that no criminal could ever again hide behind the genetic ambiguity of an identical birth. The story of the twin brothers had by now become a dark parable studied in universities and law schools across the globe, a case study in the absolute limits of human perception and the terrifying power of institutional bias. The valley where it all began sat in the quiet transition between winter and spring, the melting snow revealing the raw, scarred earth of the logging tracks that had held the secrets for so long. The people of the valley walked their streets with a lowered gaze, understanding that the resolution of the 1986 mystery had not brought a clean or redemptive closure. It had merely pulled back the curtain on a vast, continental highway of shadows, leaving them to live with the permanent, chilling realization that the face they had hated for 40 years was the face of an innocent victim, while the hand that had brought them together in community was the very hand that had put their daughters in the dirt. The melting of the snows in the late spring of 2027 did not bring a rebirth to the valleys of Western Oregon. It brought a final, unvarnished exposure of the architecture of a monster. As the high mountain passes of the Cascades gradually cleared, revealing the saturated black soil and the raw, ancient root systems of the timberlands, the task force returned to the coordinates etched on Darren Miller's yellow legal pad. They moved with a quiet, military precision, their heavy yellow excavators and ground-penetrating radar units slicing through the pristine mountain silence. The physical hunt was no longer fueled by the frantic desperation of a fresh investigation. It had transformed into a somber, sacred archival process, a systematic effort to dismantle the private cemetery that a single man had maintained for over 3 decades under the protective coloring of his brother's face. By the time the final recovery operations were completed in the summer of 2027, the task force had located the remains of 4 additional victims within a 50-mile radius of the original 1986 crime scene. Each site was a replica of the mechanics used to bury Karen Vance, an isolated timber tract, a deep burial beneath a natural forest marker, and a meticulous application of forest materials to ensure that the earth looked undisturbed to the casual eye. The total body count officially attributed to Darren Miller across 3 states and 1 Canadian province reached 14, establishing him as one of the most prolific and devastatingly successful serial predators in the history of the North American continent. Yet, to the behavioral analysts who finalized his case file, the numbers were secondary to the terrifying psychological methodology of his survival, the reality that his entire life had been a masterclass in biological camouflage. In the federal court facility in Portland, the legal proceedings against Darren Miller came to a swift, unceremonious conclusion. Faced with the overwhelming, multi-layered digital evidence from his decrypted hard drive and the flawless precision of the ultra-deep whole genome sequencing data, Darren's defense team offered no resistance. He entered a final, unappealable plea of guilty to all 20 federal counts, waiving his right to any future judicial review or institutional commutation. The sentencing hearing was a brief, sterile affair, devoid of the theatrical elements that usually accompany high-profile trials. Darren sat at the defense table, his frame slightly more stooped than it had been a year ago, his flint-gray eyes staring at the mahogany floor as the federal judge pronounced a consecutive series of life sentences without the possibility of release, ordering him to be transferred to the maximum security federal penitentiary in Florence, Colorado. As Darren was led out of the courtroom for the final time, stepping into the armored transport van that would carry him away from the Pacific Northwest forever, he left behind a landscape that was permanently altered by his deception. The small town outside Eugene where the twins had grown up began a slow, agonizing process of structural dissolution. The lumber mill, which had been the economic heartbeat of the valley for a century, closed its doors permanently in the fall of 2027, its collapse accelerated by the toxic publicity and the legal liabilities stemming from the corporate logging contracts that Darren had utilized to scout his hunting grounds. The young families moved away, seeking anonymity in the larger cities, leaving the main street of the town to be reclaimed by the same persistent rain and encroaching moss that had covered Karen Vance's grave for 40 years. The scientific legacy of the case, however, radiated across the globe, permanently redefining the boundaries of forensic biology. The Miller Mutation Protocol was officially integrated into the standard operating procedures of Interpol and the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS. Across 5 continents, cold case squads began utilizing deep genome sequencing to re-examine unresolved homicides where identical twins had previously been dismissed as suspects due to genetic ambiguity. The loophole that had allowed Darren Miller to operate with total biological immunity was permanently closed, ensuring that no future predator could ever again use the sacred, mysterious bond of an identical birth as a weapon of absolute evasion. The science had caught up with the deception, transforming a microscopic cellular error into an infallible instrument of late-stage justice. But for the individuals who had survived the blast radius of Darren's life, the systemic updates and historical milestones offered cold comfort. In the windswept expanses of northern Wyoming, David Miller continued his solitary existence at the forge. He did not read the final reports from the federal trial. He did not accept the financial restitution offered by the state's Victim Compensation Fund, and he refused to participate in the multiple documentary projects that sought to commercialize his suffering. He remained a silhouette against the jagged peaks of the Absaroka Range, a man who had successfully cleared his name but had left his life behind in the wet clay of the Oregon timberlands. He had exposed the ghost that shared his face, but in doing so, he had accepted that some damages are too deep for the law to repair and some silences are the only peace left to cultivate. The empty cabin where Karen Vance had lived her final hours remained undisturbed through the transition of seasons, a quiet monument to a tragedy that had taken 40 years to fully reveal its shape. The current owners of the timber tract chose to leave the surrounding acreage unlogged, creating a small, informal sanctuary where the ancient pines could continue their long, silent vigil. To the casual travelers who occasionally drove past the property on their way to the coast, the landscape looked like any other section of the Pacific Northwest, dense, green, and beautiful against the gray afternoon sky. But to those who knew the history, the forest carried a different frequency. It stood as a permanent reminder of the darkness that can thrive when a community chooses vengeance over evidence, and how the truth, hidden deep within the very fabric of our blood, will eventually find its way through the rain, through the years, and into the light. The high-security transport van carrying Darren Miller crossed the state line under a starless, midnight sky, moving him toward the absolute isolation of the federal Supermax facility in Colorado. In the wake of his permanent departure, the Pacific Northwest was left to navigate the heavy, stagnant air of a collective mourning after. The media circus, which had sustained an artificial, high-voltage energy for over a year, rapidly deflated as there were no more graves to locate, no more secret hard drives to decrypt, and no more dramatic court appearances to broadcast. The red pins on the task force's mapping walls were finally cataloged into digital storage boxes, and the multi-agency bunker in Salem returned to its original state as a quiet, fluorescent-lit administrative basement. The system had run its course, the equations of modern genetic science had been solved, and the legal machinery had ground out its final, absolute consensus. Yet, as the state police officially disbanded the specialized cold case unit in the late autumn of 2027, the real, uncinematic aftermath began to settle into the bones of the valley. The institutional reckoning shifted from the grand courtrooms to the mundane, day-to-day realities of local government records. Criminologists and legal historians from the State University arrived in Lane County to conduct a comprehensive audit of the historical archives, seeking to understand the precise administrative mechanisms that had allowed Darren's deception to survive the scrutiny of 4 decades. What they discovered was not a complex, criminal mastermind network, but a mundane ledger of systemic convenience. The files revealed that every time an independent tip had been logged by a junior officer suggesting an alternative suspect, it was systematically overruled by senior investigators who had already staked their professional reputations and the county's limited budget on the absolute certainty of the fiancé's guilt. The psychological weight of this realization poisoned the local law enforcement apparatus from the inside out. Several retired deputies, who had been young patrolmen during the initial 1986 investigation, found themselves living out their golden years under a cloud of deep, communal resentment. They were no longer viewed as the vintage protectors of a bygone era. They were seen as the stubborn architects of a historic failure who had left an active serial predator free to terrorize the interstate corridors for 30 years. The local police union filed multiple grievances against the county council, attempting to shield their members from the public outcries, but the trust had been completely eroded. The community had looked into the historical record and realized that their own safety had been bartered away for the sake of an easy, closed file. In the maximum security isolation of Florence, Colorado, Darren Miller adapted to his final environment with the same clinical, predatory efficiency that had defined his entire life. The Supermax facility, designed to completely eliminate human contact and sensory stimulation, was an environment that would break the sanity of an ordinary man within months. But to Darren, the concrete box was simply another logistical parameters to master. He spent his 23 hours of daily lockdown in absolute stillness, his flint-gray eyes tracking the movement of the automated security cameras with a cold, unblinking focus. He did not request visitors, he did not write letters, and he refused to participate in the mandatory institutional evaluations. He had become an absolute archive of one, a man who carried the unmapped coordinates of a continental campaign of violence entirely within his own mind, fully aware that his silence was the final, unassailable weapon he possessed against the system that had caged him. Back in the valley, the physical landscape continued its slow, indifferent reclamation of the past. The timber firm that had cleared David Miller's old property completed its work, leaving a vast, geometric grid of commercial seedlings where the old mechanic shop had once stood. The local high school, unable to overcome the generational shame of the revelations and the economic collapse of the logging mill, was officially consolidated into a larger regional district down the highway. The old brick building, which had once echoed with the voices of both brothers in the early 1980s, was boarded up, its windows covered in heavy plywood, its asphalt parking lot slowly split apart by the persistent, unyielding growth of wild ferns and blackberry brambles. The valley was systematically erasing the architectural